Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. The Texas Hill Country has a way of etching itself into your memory. Its rugged beauty, with rolling hills covered in cedar and oak, can be both breathtaking and intimidating. It's a landscape that seems to hold secrets, whispering them only to those who listen closely. It was in this setting that an experience occurred which has stayed with me for years, a mystery that still sends a chill down my spine when I recall it. I was 10 years old at the time, an age when the world is full of wonder and possibility, but also when the line between reality and imagination can blur in the most unsettling ways. It was a crisp autumn evening, either late October or early November. The exact date has faded from my memory, but the events of that night remain vivid. My friend Charlie's family owned a ranch in the heart of the hill country. Their house sat atop one of the many hills that characterized the region, a vantage point that offered spectacular views during the day, but transformed into an island of light in a sea of darkness after sunset. The only connection to the outside world was a winding dirt driveway that snaked its way up the hill, cutting through the dense growth of cedar trees that covered the wild land surrounding their property. Charlie's parents had invited a group of us for a sleepover. 5 or 6 girls, all around the same age, excited for a night of games, gossip, and the thrill of staying up past our usual bedtimes. We had spent the afternoon exploring the ranch, marveling at the livestock, and imagining ourselves as cowgirls in some grand western adventure, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. We gathered on the porch of Charlie's house. The air had a slight chill to it, just enough to make us pull our sweaters a little tighter around our shoulders. The moon was rising, full and bright, casting long shadows across the landscape. Charlie's mom called us in for dinner, a feast of homemade pizza and sodas, a treat for us city kids used to more mundane fare. As we ate, we chatted excitedly about our plans for the evening. Charlie's parents were relaxed about letting us play outside after dark. The ranch was well fenced, they assured us, and far from any main roads. What harm could come to a group of young girls playing in the yard? Little did we know that the night ahead would challenge that assumption in ways we couldn't have imagined. After dinner, as the last traces of daylight faded from the sky, we burst out of the house, our energy levels spiking with the sugar from dinner and the excitement of being allowed to play outside after dark. The moon was now high in the sky, bathing everything in a soft, silvery light that transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and mysterious. Someone, I can't remember who, suggested we play hide and seek. It seemed like the perfect game for the setting. The long driveway, the clusters of cedar trees, the various outbuildings of the ranch all offered tantalizing hiding spots. We quickly established the rules. The driveway would be base, the safe zone where the seeker would count and where the hiders needed to run to once found. The boundaries were set at the house at the top of the hill and a cattle grid at the bottom of the driveway. The first few rounds were filled with shrieks of laughter and the pounding of feet on packed earth as we discovered the best hiding spots and perfected our strategies for making it back to base undetected. The cool night air on our flushed cheeks, the crunch of gravel under our sneakers, the rustle of wind through the cedar trees, it all added to the exhilaration of the game. As the night wore on, we became bolder in our hiding spots, venturing further from the safety of the driveway and deeper into the shadows cast by the trees and hillside. It was during one of these later rounds that things took a turn towards the inexplicable. I had paired up with my friend Gina for this round. We had a system. 2 sets of eyes were better than 1 for spotting the seeker, and we could take turns creating distractions if needed. We had found a perfect spot. A large ridge of dirt just off the side of the driveway, probably left over from when the road was first cut into the hillside. It offered both concealment and a good view of the approach to base. We huddled behind the dirt ridge, our hearts pounding with excitement and the thrill of potentially being the last ones found. We could hear the seeker, I think it was Sarah that round, calling out as she found the others one by one. "Found you, Jessica." "Got you, Emma." Each call brought a mix of relief we hadn't been spotted yet, and increased tension. Our turn was coming. We heard footsteps approaching our hiding spot and held our breath, pressing ourselves flatter against the cool earth. The footsteps paused nearby. We could hear whispered conversation. It seemed Sarah had enlisted the help of the others she had found to track down the remaining hiders. This was it. We were the last ones out there. Gina looked at me, a mischievous glint in her eye. She picked up a small rock and with a flick of her wrist sent it sailing over the ridge to land with a clatter on the other side of the driveway. The distraction worked perfectly. We heard excited whispers and the sound of several pairs of feet moving away from our hiding spot. We grinned at each other, flush with the success of our ruse. Now we just had to wait for the right moment to make our dash for base. The moonlight cast strange, shifting shadows as the breeze moved through the cedar trees. The night had grown quieter, the sounds of our friends' search fading as they moved further down the driveway. That's when I heard it. A sound from down the hill behind us, in the tangle of cedar trees and scrub brush that covered the steep slope. It was faint, barely audible over the whisper of wind through the trees. My first thought was that Gina had thrown another rock to further misdirect our seekers. I glanced at her, ready to commend her clever thinking, but the look on her face stopped me cold. Gina was staring at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Are you okay?" she whispered. I was about to reply when we heard it again, clearer this time. It was a voice, calling from somewhere down the hill behind us. "Help me!" The voice was faint but unmistakable. It sounded like Charlie, our host for the night. But that couldn't be right. Charlie had been with the group searching for us, hadn't she? For a moment, Gina and I just stared at each other, frozen in disbelief. Then, as if a spell had been broken, we both bolted upright, no longer caring about the game of hide and seek. "Hey!" we yelled, waving our arms to get the attention of our friends further down the driveway. "Come here, quick!" The urgency in our voices must have been clear because the others came running immediately. As they gathered around us, we quickly explained what we had heard. No one had seen Charlie since the start of this round of hide and seek. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air ran through the group. We clustered together at the spot where Gina and I had been hiding and called out Charlie's name. For a heart-stopping moment, there was only silence. Then from even further down the hill, we heard it again. "Help! I'm stuck!" The voice was fainter now, as if moving away from us. It still sounded like Charlie, but there was something off about it. Something in the tone that didn't quite match our friend's usual voice. Panic set in. Without discussion, we all turned and ran up the driveway towards the house as fast as our legs could carry us. The once fun shadows now seemed menacing, reaching out with dark fingers as if trying to grab us. The moonlight that had earlier seemed magical now cast an eerie glow over everything, making familiar shapes seem alien and threatening. We burst through the kitchen door, ready to raise the alarm, only to pull up short in shock. There, sitting at the kitchen bar, calmly eating a popsicle, was Charlie. "I wondered how long it was going to take for you to find me," she said with a grin, clearly pleased with herself for having evaded detection for so long. The relief of seeing Charlie safe was quickly overtaken by confusion and a growing sense of unease. If Charlie had been here the whole time, what had we heard in the woods? Our commotion had attracted the attention of Charlie's parents. As they came to investigate the source of the disturbance, we poured out our story in a jumble of excited voices, each of us trying to explain what had happened. Charlie's father listened gravely, his expression growing more serious as we recounted hearing the calls for help. When we finished, he exchanged a look with his wife that I couldn't quite interpret. Without a word, he went to a cabinet and pulled out a shotgun. "I'm going to drive around the property," he said, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of tension, "just to make sure there's no one out there who shouldn't be." We watched from the window as he got into his truck and drove off, the beams of the headlights cutting through the darkness. The wait for his return seemed interminable. We huddled together in the living room, jumping at every sound from outside. Charlie's mom tried to distract us with snacks and a movie, but none of us could focus on the screen. When Charlie's dad finally returned, we all held our breath, waiting for news. But he had found nothing. No signs of intruders, no explanation for the voice we had heard. "Probably just the wind playing tricks," he said, with a forced cheerfulness that didn't quite reach his eyes. "These hills can create some strange echoes sometimes." We nodded, wanting to believe this rational explanation. But deep down, I think we all knew that what we had heard was more than just the wind or a trick of acoustics. The rest of the night passed in a blur. We went through the motions of our planned sleepover activities, but the carefree joy of earlier had evaporated. We slept fitfully, each unexpected noise from outside jolting us awake. In the harsh light of day, the events of the previous night seemed almost dreamlike. We didn't talk about it much as we ate breakfast and packed up to go home. But I could see in the eyes of my friends that the memory of that voice calling for help was as vivid for them as it was for me. As the years have passed, that night has remained a topic of speculation among those of us who were there. We've shared theories ranging from the rational, a hiker lost in the woods, sound carrying strangely in the night air, to the fantastical, ghostly echoes, supernatural mimicry. But none of the explanations have ever fully satisfied me or erased the chill I feel when I remember that voice in the darkness. Now, as an adult, I find myself returning to the memory of that night more often than I'd like to admit. I've researched similar phenomena, read accounts of other people hearing unexplained voices outdoors. Some attribute it to pareidolia, the tendency of the human mind to find patterns or meaning in random stimuli. Others point to more supernatural explanations. But whatever the cause, the experience left an indelible mark on me. It was a stark reminder that the world is full of mysteries, that there are things beyond our understanding lurking in the shadows. It taught me to trust my instincts, to be aware of my surroundings, and to never take safety for granted. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself listening closely, half expecting to hear that faint call for help again. And in those moments, I'm transported back to that hill in the Texas countryside, to a night when the line between the known and the unknown blurred, leaving behind a mystery that continues to haunt me to this day. The experience also had a profound effect on our group dynamic. For weeks afterward, sleepovers at Charlie's ranch took on a different tone. We still played outside, still enjoyed the beauty of the hill country, but there was always an undercurrent of wariness, a heightened awareness of our surroundings. We stayed closer to the house after dark, and games of hide-and-seek were relegated to daylight hours only. Charlie's parents, too, seemed changed by the incident. Though they never said anything outright, I noticed that they became more vigilant about knowing exactly where we were when we visited. The carefree attitude about letting us roam the property after dark was replaced by stricter boundaries and more frequent check-ins. As we grew older and began to drift apart, as childhood friends often do, that night remained a touchstone for our group. Whenever we would reunite, the conversation would inevitably turn to our shared experience. "Do you remember that night at Charlie's ranch?" Someone would ask, and we'd all fall silent, lost in our own memories of that eerie call in the darkness. I've often wondered about the long-term impact of such an experience on young minds. For me, it sparked a lifelong interest in the unexplained. I found myself drawn to books about paranormal phenomena, devouring accounts of ghostly encounters and mysterious happenings. But it also instilled in me a healthy skepticism, a desire to seek rational explanations before jumping to supernatural conclusions. As I've shared this story with others over the years, I've been struck by how many people have similar tales, not necessarily of voices in the woods, but of moments when reality seemed to shift, when the ordinary world revealed a glimpse of something beyond our understanding. It's made me realize that experiences like ours are more common than we might think. Threads of mystery woven into the fabric of everyday life. But even as I've sought explanations and collected similar stories, the memory of that night has lost none of its power to unsettle me. The sound of that voice, so familiar yet so wrong, still echoes in my mind. The feeling of panic as we ran up the driveway, certain that our friend was in danger, only to find her safe at home. It's a cognitive dissonance that I've never fully reconciled. In many ways, that night marked the end of a certain kind of innocence. It was a harsh reminder that the world is not always as safe or as explicable as we'd like to believe. But it was also, in its way, the beginning of a deeper appreciation for the mysteries that surround us, for the vast unknown that exists just beyond the edges of our understanding. As I write this account, I find myself wondering about those voices that seem to call out in the wilderness. Are they echoes of past events, somehow imprinted on the landscape? Are they manifestations of our own fears and desires, given voice by the silence of nature? Or is there something else out there? Something that can mimic human voices to lure us into the unknown? I don't have answers to these questions, but I do know that my experience that night on the Texas ranch changed me in fundamental ways. It taught me to question, to seek understanding, but also to respect the possibility that some things might always remain beyond our comprehension. To this day, whenever I find myself in a wild place as darkness falls, I feel a familiar tingle of apprehension. I listen more closely to the sounds of the night, always half expecting to hear that ghostly call for help. And in those moments, I'm reminded of the thin line that separates the world we know from the world of shadows and mysteries that exists just beyond our perception. For those who have never had such an experience, it might be easy to dismiss our story as the overactive imaginations of young girls, or to explain it away with rational arguments about sound carrying strangely in the hills. But for those of us who were there that night, who heard that voice with our own ears, the memory remains as vivid and as chilling as ever. In the end, perhaps the most unsettling aspect of our experience is not the possibility of supernatural forces, but the reminder of how little we truly understand about the world around us. In an age of scientific advancement and technological marvels, it's easy to believe that we have unraveled all of nature's mysteries. But experiences like ours serve as a humbling reminder that there is still much we don't know, much that defies easy explanation. As I conclude this account, I find myself torn between the desire for answers and the recognition that some mysteries might be better left unsolved. Part of me wants to return to that ranch, to investigate further, to try and make sense of what we heard that night. But another part of me is content to let the mystery stand, a reminder of the wonder and the terror that can exist in the most unexpected places. To those who might read this and scoff, I can only say, I hope you never have an experience that shakes your understanding of reality the way ours did. But if you do, remember our story. Remember that you're not alone in facing the unexplained. And perhaps, in sharing these experiences, we can come closer to understanding the vast, mysterious world we inhabit. As for me, I'll continue to listen closely when I'm in wild places. I'll keep an open mind to the possibilities that exist beyond our everyday understanding. And I'll always remember that night on the Texas ranch, when a simple game of hide and seek became a gateway to a mystery that continues to defy explanation. In the years since that night, I've found myself drawn to the hill country time and time again. Each visit is tinged with a mixture of nostalgia and apprehension. The landscape remains as beautiful as ever, with its rolling hills and expansive skies, but it now carries an undercurrent of mystery that I can't shake. I've revisited Charlie's ranch a few times, though not as often as I'd like. Life has a way of pulling childhood friends in different directions, and our once tight group has scattered across the country. But whenever I do return, I'm struck by how little the place has changed. The house still stands atop the hill. The dirt driveway still winds its way through the cedar trees, and the night air still carries that same crisp chill when autumn rolls around. During one visit in my early 20s, I finally worked up the courage to ask Charlie's parents about that night. They were hesitant at first, exchanging that same unreadable look I remembered from years ago. But eventually, Charlie's father opened up. "We've heard things out there before," he admitted, his voice low as if he was sharing a secret. "Not often, mind you, but enough to make us wonder. There are old stories about these hills, about spirits that lure people off the paths. We never put much stock in them, but after that night—" He trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. But I understood. That night had changed things for all of us, adults and children alike. Charlie's mother chimed in, her face etched with concern. "We've always told ourselves it's just the wind, or coyotes, or our minds playing tricks. But sometimes on quiet nights, I could swear I hear voices out there." Their words sent a chill down my spine, confirming what I had long suspected, that our experience wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger mystery surrounding the ranch and perhaps the hill country as a whole. Over the years, I've delved into research about the area's history and folklore. I've uncovered old legends of Native American spirits said to roam the hills, of lost travelers whose cries for help are said to echo long after their deaths. While I approach these stories with a healthy dose of skepticism, I can't deny the eerie parallels to our own experience. I've also reached out to locals, discreetly asking if they've ever heard anything strange in the woods at night. The responses have been mixed. Some dismiss the idea outright, attributing any unusual sounds to wildlife or the wind. But others, often after a moment of hesitation, admit to having heard inexplicable voices or calls for help. Always just on the edge of hearing, always impossible to locate, one elderly rancher, his face weathered by years under the Texas sun, told me a story that made my blood run cold. He spoke of a night in his youth when he was riding fence on a remote part of his property. As darkness fell, he heard what sounded like a child crying for help. He spent hours searching, certain that someone was in trouble, only to find nothing. When he finally made it home, exhausted and unnerved, he discovered that his young daughter, who he'd thought was safely in bed, had been sleepwalking and calling out for him. At the exact same time, he'd been hearing the cries in the woods. Stories like these have only deepened the mystery for me. They suggest a phenomenon larger than just our isolated experience, something woven into the very fabric of the hill country landscape. But what that something might be, I'm no closer to understanding now than I was on that moonlit night years ago. The experience has shaped my life in ways both subtle and profound. It's influenced my choice of reading material, drawing me towards books on folklore, paranormal phenomena, and the psychology of fear. It's made me more attuned to the unexplained, more open to possibilities that exist outside our normal understanding of the world. But it's also taught me the value of skepticism, of looking for rational explanations before leaping to supernatural conclusions. I've learned about the strange acoustics that can occur in hilly terrain, about the way certain atmospheric conditions can cause sounds to carry for miles. I've studied the psychology of group dynamics and the power of suggestion, wondering if our shared fear that night might have influenced what we thought we heard. Yet even with all this knowledge, I can't fully explain away what happened. The clarity of that voice, the specificity of its cries for help, the way it seemed to move further down the hill, these details resist easy explanation. In my professional life, I've gravitated towards fields that deal with the unknown. I spent several years working in search and rescue, driven in part by the memory of that helpless feeling of hearing someone call for aid and being unable to reach them. Later, I transitioned into psychology, fascinated by the way our minds perceive and interpret unusual experiences. Through it all, the memory of that night has remained a touchstone, a reminder of the thin veil that separates the known from the unknown. It's made me more compassionate towards those who claim to have had inexplicable experiences, more willing to listen without judgment. I've often wondered about the long-term impact of such experiences on young minds. How many other children have encountered something they can't explain, something that challenges their understanding of reality? How do these experiences shape their worldviews, their beliefs, their fears? As I've grappled with these questions, I've come to believe that encounters like ours serve an important purpose. They remind us of the vastness of the unknown, of the limitations of our understanding. They instill in us a sense of wonder and humility in the face of a universe that is far more complex and mysterious than we often acknowledge. But they also carry risks. For some, such experiences can lead to paralyzing fear or an unhealthy obsession with the paranormal. I've been careful to balance my curiosity about the unexplained with a grounded approach to daily life, recognizing that while mysteries exist, we must also engage with the tangible world around us. As I write this account, I'm struck by how vivid the memory remains after all these years. I can still feel the cool night air on my skin, still hear the rustle of cedar branches in the wind, still sense the oppressive silence that fell over the woods just before we heard that chilling call for help. I've returned to that spot on the hill many times in my mind, replaying the events of that night, searching for some detail I might have missed, some clue that could unravel the mystery. But the answer remains elusive, as intangible as the voice that called out to us in the darkness. In the end, perhaps the greatest lesson I've taken from that night is the importance of remaining open to the unknown. It's easy in our modern world to believe we have everything figured out, that science and technology have unraveled all of nature's mysteries. But experiences like ours serve as a powerful reminder that there is still much we don't understand, much that defies easy explanation. To those who might read this account with skepticism, I can only say, I understand. I too approach such stories with a critical eye, but I also encourage you to keep an open mind. The world is vast and strange, filled with wonders and terrors beyond our current comprehension. Sometimes, the most rational response to the truly inexplicable is simply to acknowledge our own limitations, to admit that there are things we cannot yet explain. And to those who have had similar experiences, who have encountered something in the darkness that defies rational explanation, I say, you are not alone. Your experiences are valid, even if they cannot be easily categorized or understood. There is value in sharing these stories, in keeping alive our sense of wonder and our recognition of the mysteries that still surround us. As for me, I continue to listen closely when I find myself in wild places, especially as night falls. I remain alert for any sound out of the ordinary, any hint of a voice carried on the wind, not out of fear, but out of a deep-seated curiosity and a lingering hope that someday I might unravel the mystery of that night on the Texas ranch. Until then, I'll carry with me the memory of that moonlit night, of the voice that called out from the darkness, and of the enduring mystery that has shaped so much of my life since. It stands as a testament to the unknown that lurks just beyond the edges of our understanding. A reminder that even in our modern world, there are still secrets waiting to be uncovered, still mysteries that defy explanation. And in that mystery, in that lingering question of what exactly we encountered that night, I find not fear, but a profound sense of wonder at the vast, unknowable world we inhabit. I'll never forget that crisp November morning when my life changed forever. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as I made my way through the dense undergrowth of the Apalachicola National Forest. It was the beginning of deer season, and I was filled with the familiar excitement of the hunt. Little did I know that I was about to become the hunted in a way I could never have imagined. The forest was unusually quiet that day. Looking back, I should have recognized it as a warning sign. But at the time, I was too focused on tracking the elusive buck I'd been dreaming about all year. I'd discovered this particular spot last season, a hidden gem that seemed untouched by other hunters. The perfect blend of dense forest and open meadows, with a small stream running through it, made it ideal deer habitat. I'd seen promising signs during my scouting trips, including some impressively large tracks that hinted at a massive buck. Today, I was sure, would be the day I'd finally encounter that trophy deer. Hours passed with agonizing slowness as I sat motionless in my blind, eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The sun had begun its descent towards the horizon when I finally made the difficult decision to call it a day. Disappointment weighed heavily on me as I packed up my gear and began the long trek back to my truck. That's when it happened, the moment that would forever divide my life into before and after. I had just stepped into a small clearing when every instinct in my body screamed danger. The forest had gone completely silent. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, nothing. And then I saw it. At first, my mind tried to categorize it as a bear, but as my eyes focused in the fading light, I realized I was face to face with something that defied explanation. The creature stood on its hind legs, towering at least 20 feet tall. Its massive body was covered in thick, dark fur, with a distinctive mane running down its back. But it was the face that sent chills down my spine. Short and brutish, it resembled nothing so much as the prehistoric short-faced bear I'd seen in museums, a creature that was supposed to have gone extinct millions of years ago. Time seemed to stand still as I locked eyes with the monstrous being. My hand instinctively moved towards my rifle, but something stopped me. The creature's gaze held an unsettling intelligence, as if it understood exactly what I was and what I was capable of. For a moment that felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. Then, with a grace that belied its enormous size, the creature dropped to all fours and melted into the forest, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and pounding heart. The drive home was a blur. My mind kept replaying the encounter, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It couldn't be real, I told myself. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or my imagination running wild after hours of solitude in the woods. But deep down, I knew the truth. What I'd seen was all too real and all too impossible. As I pulled into my driveway, I knew that my life had changed forever. The forest I thought I knew so well suddenly felt alien and dangerous. And I couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was only the beginning of something much bigger, much more terrifying than I could possibly imagine. In the days following my encounter, I found myself consumed by an obsessive need to understand what I had seen. I spent countless hours researching, poring over books about extinct megafauna, and scouring the internet for any mention of similar sightings in the area. My wife, Sarah, watched with growing concern as I transformed our spare room into a makeshift research center, walls covered with maps of the Apalachicola National Forest and printouts of articles about cryptozoology and evolutionary biology. It was during this feverish research that I stumbled upon a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight. Reports of unusually large animal sightings, inexplicable livestock killings, and strange tracks found in remote areas of the forest had been trickling in for years. Most had been dismissed as exaggerations or misidentifications, but when I plotted them on a map, a clear pattern emerged. All of these incidents clustered around the area where I had my encounter. I knew I needed help to pursue this further. But who could I trust with something so unbelievable? The answer came in the form of an unexpected ally, my neighbor, Bill Thompson. I'd noticed Bill watching me with concern over the past few days, and one evening, as I was taking out the trash, he approached me. "Everything all right, Jake?" he called out, his weathered face creased with worry. "You look like you've seen a ghost." In that moment, something compelled me to take a chance. I invited Bill inside, and over a couple of beers, I told him everything. To my surprise, instead of skepticism, I saw recognition dawn in his eyes. Bill, it turned out, had his own story to tell. A month prior, he had lost 4 of his prized racehorses in a single night. The animals had been torn apart with a savagery that defied explanation, and the tracks left behind were like nothing he'd ever seen. As we talked late into the night, a plan began to form. We needed to mount an expedition back into the forest to find proof of what we both now believed was out there. But we couldn't do it alone. We needed a team, people with the skills and knowledge to help us document and understand what we were dealing with. Over the next few weeks, I reached out to old contacts and made new ones. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a wildlife biologist specializing in large predators, was the first to join our team. Her enthusiasm was infectious. She'd been hearing whispers about anomalous wildlife activity for years and jumped at the chance to investigate. Marcus Green, a local game warden and old hunting buddy, was more skeptical but agreed to join us out of concern for public safety. The final member of our team came as a suggestion from Bill. David. Chen was a tech entrepreneur who'd made his fortune developing cutting-edge wildlife cameras and tracking devices. When I met with David to explain our mission, his eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "I've been waiting for an opportunity like this my whole life," he said, immediately offering us access to his latest prototypes, equipment that could give us an edge in tracking and documenting our elusive quarry. As our team came together and our plans took shape, I felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. We were about to venture into unknown territory, both literally and figuratively. If we succeeded, we could be on the verge of a discovery that would rewrite the books on zoology and challenge everything we thought we knew about evolution and survival. But I also couldn't shake a nagging feeling of unease. The memory of those intelligent, almost human eyes staring back at me from the face of the giant beast lingered in my mind. Whatever we were dealing with, I suspected it was far more than just an undiscovered animal. It was something ancient, something that had survived against all odds for millions of years. As I packed my gear for the expedition, checking and rechecking my equipment, I found myself wondering, were we the hunters in this scenario or the hunted? Only time would tell, and the deep, dark woods of Apalachicola held their secrets close. Whatever awaited us in the forest, I knew our lives would never be the same again. The day of our expedition dawned crisp and clear, the kind of perfect autumn morning that would normally have me itching to be in my deer stand. But today, as I helped load our vehicles with an arsenal of high-tech equipment, my mind was focused on a very different kind of hunt. Our team gathered at the edge of the Apalachicola National Forest, an air of nervous excitement hanging over us. We were about to step into a world where the impossible might become reality, and none of us knew quite what to expect. Elena busied herself with a final check of our scientific equipment, muttering a litany of camera check, DNA collection kits check, thermal imaging gear check, as she ticked off items on her list. Her enthusiasm was palpable, and I found it oddly reassuring. If nothing else, we were about to embark on the scientific adventure of a lifetime. Marcus, ever the pragmatist, was hunched over a spread of maps, plotting our route into the heart of the forest. "We'll set up base camp here," he said, pointing to a clearing near a small stream. "It's central to the area where most of the sightings have been reported, and the water source will be crucial." I nodded in agreement, remembering how the sound of running water had been one of the few things that penetrated the eerie silence during my encounter. David was in his element, fiddling with a sleek drone that looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. "This baby will give us eyes in the sky," he explained, his fingers dancing over the controls. "If there's anything big moving out there, We'll know about it. The technology was impressive, but I couldn't help but wonder if it would be enough against a creature that had managed to stay hidden for so long. As we prepared to set off, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. This had been my idea, my obsession that had drawn these people into potential danger. "Remember," I said, addressing the group, "our primary goal is observation and documentation. We're not here to confront this creature, whatever it is. Safety comes first." They all nodded solemnly, and I hoped fervently that we would all heed those words in the face of whatever we might encounter. The forest seemed to swallow us as we made our way deeper into its depths. The familiar sights and sounds of the woods took on a new significance now that we were actively searching for signs of the impossible. Every snapped twig, every rustle in the underbrush, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I found myself constantly scanning our surroundings, half expecting to see a pair of intelligent eyes staring back at me from between the trees. As we hiked, Elena pointed out various tracks and signs, her trained eye picking up details I would have missed. "Look here," she said at one point, crouching by a large paw print. "This is from a black bear, but look at the size. It's much larger than average." Marcus frowned as he examined the print. "Could be natural variation," he mused, "but it's worth noting. The ecosystem here does seem different somehow." He was right. As the day wore on, we began to notice other oddities. Trees with bark stripped away at impossible heights, massive claw marks scoring trunks, and always a pervasive sense of being watched. It was as if the forest itself was aware of our presence, evaluating our intentions. By late afternoon, we reached the clearing where we planned to set up base camp. As we began to pitch tents and set up equipment, the silence was suddenly broken by a sharp beep from David's drone controller. "Movement," he said, his eyes glued to the screen. "Something big, about 2 miles north of us." We all gathered around, watching in fascinated silence as a large heat signature moved through the forest on the drone's thermal imaging display. It was far larger than any known animal in the area should be. "That's it," I breathed, my heart racing. "That's what I saw." Elena was already grabbing her gear, her face alight with scientific curiosity. "We need to get closer. Set up some camera traps along its path." But Marcus held up a hand, ever the voice of caution. "Wait, it's getting dark. We don't want to be stumbling around these woods at night, especially not with that thing out there." After some debate, we decided to wait until morning to investigate further. But as I lay in my tent that night, sleep eluded me. Strange noises echoed through the forest, branches cracked ominously in the distance, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed, evaluated. Whatever was out there, it knew we were here, and tomorrow we would be venturing into its territory, seeking answers to questions that perhaps were better left unasked. As I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, my dreams were filled with images of ancient beasts and shadowy forests. In the morning, we would be heading into the unknown, and I couldn't help but wonder if we were prepared for what we might find. The forest held its secrets close, but we were determined to uncover them, whatever the cost. The pre-dawn darkness found us already awake and preparing for the day ahead. There was a palpable tension in the air as we ate a hurried breakfast and gathered our gear. Today was the day we would actively seek out the creature I had encountered, and the mix of excitement and apprehension was almost overwhelming. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the canopy, we set out towards the area where David's drone had detected movement the previous evening. We moved cautiously, our senses on high alert. Elena and David took the lead, setting up camera traps and collecting samples as we went. Marcus and I brought up the rear, our eyes constantly scanning our surroundings for any sign of danger. The forest seemed different in the early morning light. Mist clung to the ground, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that only heightened our sense of entering unknown territory. As we pushed deeper into the woods, the signs of an unusual presence became more pronounced. We found trees that had been marked with claw marks far higher than any known animal in the area could reach. Massive tracks in the soft earth told of a creature of impossible size. Suddenly Marcus held up a hand, signaling for silence. In the distance, we could hear the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. The team froze, hardly daring to breathe. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure it would give away our position. And then we saw it. Emerging from between two massive oak trees came a creature that defied belief. It stood nearly 20 feet tall, its muscular body covered in thick, dark fur. The face was bear-like, but with a shorter snout and eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. It was exactly as I remembered from my first encounter, but seeing it here, in the full light of day, was even more awe-inspiring and terrifying. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as we regarded each other. I could hear Elena's camera clicking furiously beside me, and David's drone hummed somewhere overhead. But my entire focus was on those eyes that seemed to hold wisdom and knowledge far beyond anything I could comprehend. Then, with a speed that belied its enormous size, the beast turned and disappeared into the forest. The entire encounter had lasted no more than a few seconds, but I knew that those moments would be forever etched in my memory. Did everyone see that? I whispered, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and exhilaration. Elena nodded, her face pale but her eyes shining with excitement. "We just made history," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "There was a living, breathing, short-faced bear, a species that's been extinct for over 11,000 years. As the implications of what we'd seen began to sink in, a mix of emotions washed over me. We had come seeking answers, and in a matter of moments, our entire understanding of the natural world had been turned upside down. But as I looked at the faces of my teammates, I realized that this was only the beginning. We had opened a door to a world of mysteries, and now we had to decide what to do with the knowledge we had gained. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. We combed the area where we'd seen the creature, collecting hair samples, documenting tracks, and reviewing footage from our camera traps. Each new piece of evidence only served to confirm the impossible. We were dealing with a species that should not exist, a living fossil that had somehow survived undetected for millennia. But as our excitement grew, so did our concerns. The implications of our discovery were staggering, and the potential consequences of revealing it to the world were equally enormous. As we sat around the campfire each night, debating our next steps, I found myself grappling with a moral dilemma I had never anticipated when I first set out on this expedition. We had entered this forest as scientists and explorers, seeking to uncover its secrets. But now, as we prepared to return to the world beyond these ancient trees, I realized that we had become something more. We were guardians of a truth that could change everything, or destroy a miracle that had survived against all odds. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. But as I looked at the determined faces of my teammates, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. As we packed up our camp on the final day of our expedition, I took a moment to stand alone at the edge of the clearing. Somewhere out there, hidden in the green depths of the forest, an impossible creature was going about its business, unaware of the turmoil its existence had caused in our lives. I felt a profound sense of privilege at being one of the few humans to know the truth, but also a deep uncertainty about what the future might hold. "Ready to go?" Elena's voice broke into my thoughts. I turned to see her standing behind me, her eyes reflecting the same mix of emotions I was feeling. I nodded, taking one last look at the towering trees that now held so many secrets. "Ready," I said, my voice firm with newfound determination. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us." And with that, we began the journey back to a world that had no idea how profoundly it had just changed. The forest kept its secrets, but now it had allies, humans who would work to protect its mysteries, while as we emerged from the Apalachicola National Forest, blinking in the harsh light of the outside world, I felt as though we were returning from another planet. The weight of our discovery pressed heavily upon us, a secret burden that set us apart from the oblivious people we passed on our drive back to civilization. In the weeks that followed, our team met regularly in the makeshift lab we'd set up in my garage. Elena pored over the DNA samples we'd collected, her brow furrowed in concentration as she compared them to known species. David worked tirelessly to enhance our video footage, trying to extract every possible detail from the fleeting images we'd captured. Marcus and I focused on compiling our field notes, mapping out the creature's territory based on the signs we'd observed. As the evidence mounted, so did our certainty and our dilemma. We had irrefutable proof of a living, breathing species that science declared extinct millions of years ago. The implications were staggering, potentially rewriting everything we thought we knew about evolution and survival. But with this knowledge came a terrible responsibility. We can't just sit on this information, David argued during one of our late-night discussions. Think of the scientific implications, the advancements in biology and ecology we could make. Marcus shook his head, his face grim. And think of what would happen if this got out. The forest would be overrun with trophy hunters, media circus, government agents. We'd be destroying the very thing we discovered. I understood both perspectives all too well. The scientist in me yearned to share our findings with the world, to bask in the acclaim that would surely follow such a monumental discovery. But I couldn't shake the memory of those intelligent eyes, the way the creature had regarded us with what seemed like conscious awareness. Did we have the right to expose its existence without considering the consequences? As we grappled with this ethical dilemma, our research took an unexpected turn. Elena, in her meticulous analysis of our collected data, noticed something peculiar in the drone footage. "Look at this," she said one evening, calling us all to crowd around her computer screen. "See how it moves through the forest? The way it navigates obstacles and chooses paths. It's not random. There's a pattern here, almost like it's following established routes." We watched in fascinated silence as she played the footage again and again. The more we observed, the more evident it became. The creature wasn't just wandering aimlessly. It moved with purpose, with an understanding of its environment that spoke of more than just animal instinct. This revelation led us down a new path of investigation. We began to look not just for physical evidence of the creature's existence, but for signs of behavior, of intelligence. And what we found astonished us. Deep in the forest, in areas we had previously overlooked, we discovered what appeared to be primitive structures. Branches woven together to form rudimentary shelters, stones arranged in patterns that couldn't be natural, and most intriguingly, markings on trees that looked suspiciously like a form of communication. "This is incredible," Elena breathed as we examined a series of deep gouges in a massive oak. "These marks, they're too uniform, too deliberate to be random. It's almost like they're trying to tell us something," I finished, my mind reeling with the implications. The more we looked, the more we found. Our mysterious creatures weren't just surviving. They were thriving, adapting, perhaps even evolving in ways we couldn't begin to understand. And with each new discovery, the weight of our responsibility grew heavier. It was Marcus who finally voiced what we had all been thinking. "We're not dealing with animals here," he said quietly one night as we sat around the campfire on our latest expedition. "At least, not in the way we typically think of them. These beings, they're intelligent. Possibly as intelligent as us, maybe more so." The silence that followed was profound. We had entered the forest looking for an undiscovered species, and instead we had found, what, Piers? An entirely new form of intelligent life that had been living alongside us, undetected for millennia. As we grappled with this paradigm-shifting realization, we knew that our approach had to change. We weren't just scientists studying a subject anymore. We had become ambassadors to a hidden civilization, carrying the weight of two worlds on our shoulders. In the days that followed, we focused our efforts on trying to establish communication. Elena, drawing on her knowledge of primate behavior and sign language, began to develop a system of gestures we hoped might bridge the gap between our species. David rigged up a series of non-invasive sensors throughout the forest, hoping to gain more insights into the creature's movements and behavior patterns without disturbing them. And me, I found myself spending more and more time simply sitting in the forest, observing, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that these beings were aware of us, watching us as much as we were watching them. And I hoped that somehow we might find a way to truly connect. It was on one such vigil, as the sun was setting and the forest was bathed in golden light, that it happened. I'd been sitting motionless for hours when I sensed rather than saw a presence nearby. Slowly, carefully, I turned my head. There, not 20 feet away, stood one of the creatures. It was smaller than the others we had seen, perhaps a juvenile, and it was watching me with unmistakable curiosity. For a long moment, we simply regarded each other. Then, moving with deliberate slowness, I raised my hand in one of the gestures Eleanor had been practicing. To my astonishment, the creature mimicked the movement, its eyes never leaving mine. My heart pounding, I made another gesture. Again the creature responded, and then, to my utter amazement, it made a gesture of its own, one I had never seen before. As I sat there, engaged in this silent conversation with a being that by all rights shouldn't exist, I felt a profound sense of awe and humility wash over me. We had come to the forest seeking answers, but instead we had found questions beyond our wildest imaginings. I knew in that moment that our lives, and potentially the course of human history, had changed forever. We had discovered not just a new species, but a new world, one that had existed alongside us all along, hidden in the shadows of the ancient forest. As the creature eventually melted back into the gathering darkness, I remained sitting, my mind racing with the implications of what had just occurred. We had made contact. Now the real work would begin. The weeks and months that followed our breakthrough were a whirlwind of activity, discovery, and profound philosophical debates. Our team, once united in the simple goal of documenting an unknown species, now found ourselves grappling with questions that stretched the boundaries of science, ethics, and our understanding of intelligence itself. Elena threw herself into the task of developing our rudimentary communication system, working tirelessly to expand our vocabulary of gestures and signs. David's tech skills proved invaluable as we set up a network of cameras and sensors throughout the forest, allowing us to observe our new friends, as we had begun to call them, without constantly intruding on their territory. Marcus, ever the pragmatist, focused on the logistics of keeping our discovery secret while also gathering the data we needed. He developed elaborate cover stories for our frequent forays into the forest and worked to deflect the curiosity of locals who had begun to notice our unusual activities. And me? I found myself in the unexpected role of diplomat, spending more and more time in the forest, slowly building trust with the creatures we now knew called themselves the Old Ones, in their complex system of gestures and vocalizations. It was during one of these encounters that we made perhaps our most startling discovery yet. I'd been sitting in my usual spot, engaged in a silent conversation with one of the Old Ones, when it suddenly made a series of gestures I had never seen before. Confused, I shook my head, trying to convey that I didn't understand. The creature seemed to consider for a moment. Then, to my amazement, it began to scratch in the dirt with one massive claw. As I watched, dumbfounded, a series of crude but recognizable symbols took shape on the ground. It was drawing, not just abstract shapes, but what appeared to be a map of the forest, complete with landmarks I recognized. When I reported this back to the team, it sparked a flurry of new theories and investigations. If the Old Ones were capable of representational art, what other cognitive abilities might they possess? How deep did their intelligence truly run? As we delved deeper into their world, we began to uncover a rich culture that defied our expectations at every turn. We found evidence of tool use, of complex social structures, even what appeared to be rudimentary agriculture in carefully tended forest clearings. But with each new discovery came new ethical dilemmas. We were now keepers of a secret that could reshape the world's understanding of intelligence, evolution, and humanity's place in the natural order. The pressure to publish our findings, to share this incredible discovery with the scientific community, was immense. Yet we also understood the terrible risk. If knowledge of the old ones became public, their peaceful existence would be shattered forever. The forest would be overrun with curiosity seekers, poachers, and exploiters of all kinds. We had seen how human encroachment had affected other species. How much more devastating would it be to a population as small and specialized as the old ones? It was Elena who finally proposed a solution. "We need to let them decide," she said during one of our nightly debates. "This is their secret, their lives. We should present them with the options and potential consequences and respect their choice." The idea was radical, unprecedented. Could we truly communicate such complex ideas to the old ones? And if we could, how would we interpret their response? It took weeks of preparation, of refining our communication methods, and debating how to present the information fairly. When we finally felt ready, we arranged a meeting with the old ones' leaders, a concept we had only recently begun to understand existed within their society. On a crisp autumn morning, not unlike the day of my first encounter, we gathered in a forest clearing. As the old ones emerged from the trees, their massive forms moving with surprising grace, I felt a sense of awe that had not diminished despite our months of interaction. Through a combination of gestures, drawings, and our still limited shared vocabulary, we laid out the situation. We explained the concept of the wider human world, of science and discovery. We tried to convey both the potential benefits of revealing their existence, protection, resources, exchange of knowledge, and the likely dangers. The response, when it came, was both surprising and somehow inevitable. The old ones, it seemed, had been having a similar debate among themselves for generations. Some had argued for reaching out to humans, seeking alliance and protection. Others had insisted that secrecy was their only defense against a world that might not understand or accept them. In the end, their decision was one of cautious optimism. They did not wish to reveal themselves to the world at large, but they were willing to cautiously expand their contact with humans. Our team would be allowed to document our findings, but in a limited way. We could speak of a previously undiscovered bear species, but the true nature of the old one's intelligence and society would remain hidden, at least for now. As we prepared to leave the forest that day, our minds reeling with the implications of this decision, I found myself lingering behind. One of the old ones, the first I had ever made contact with, approached me. It made a series of gestures that we had come to understand meant something like future or path ahead. I nodded, trying to convey my understanding. The creature then did something unprecedented. It reached out one massive paw and gently, so gently, rested it on my shoulder. The weight was enormous, but the gesture was unmistakably one of connection, of shared purpose. As I looked into those ancient, intelligent eyes, I felt a profound sense of responsibility and hope. We had entered this forest as scientists seeking to uncover its secrets. We were leaving as guardians of one of the greatest mysteries in human history, and as bridges between two worlds that had existed side by side for millennia without truly seeing each other. The path ahead would not be easy. We had papers to write, carefully crafted to protect the old ones while still advancing human knowledge. We had a network of trusted individuals to build, people who could help us safeguard this secret and slowly, carefully, prepare the world for the possibility of a profound shift in our understanding of intelligence and our place in the natural world. But more than that, We had a new understanding of the complexity and wonder of the world around us. As I watched the old ones melt back into their forest home, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The line between legend and reality had blurred, and in that blurring lay infinite possibilities for discovery, for connection, and for a future in which humans and old ones might someday walk side by side in the dappled sunlight of their ancient forest home. The calendar on my phone read March 15th, 2024, when I received the text that would change my life forever. I'm Sam Morrison, and until that day, I was just another marine biology graduate student at Penn State, more comfortable with textbooks than actual diving. The message was from Megan Wade, my research partner, and the closest thing I had to a best friend in our small department. Found something incredible, her text read. Ancient underwater structure in Ridley Creek State Park. Way more than just the known ruins. Need to document this ASAP. I should have known better. Should have trusted that creeping sensation of wrongness that crawled up my spine when I read those words. But Megan had always been our fearless leader, the one who pushed boundaries and made discoveries. She'd already published 2 papers during her PhD work, while I was still struggling with my thesis proposal. When she called an hour later to explain more, her excitement was contagious. "Sam, this could be huge," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. Local divers found some new caverns during the winter floods. They're saying there are carved symbols that don't match any known Native American patterns. We need to get down there before anyone else documents this. That's how she convinced me to join her expedition. That's how she got Kim Chen, our department's underwater photography specialist, to come along too. Kim was quieter than Megan, more methodical, more like me. She'd replaced Rachel Torres on our research team after Rachel took a position at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. We spent the next week preparing, gathering equipment, and reviewing safety protocols. Megan insisted we keep everything quiet. No filing dive plans with the Park Service, no telling our advisors. They'll just shut it down, she argued. Make us wait for permits and archaeological surveys. By then, someone else will have published. I remember sitting in my apartment the night before the dive, cleaning my equipment for the 3rd time, unable to shake the feeling that we were making a terrible mistake. The moon was full that night, casting long shadows across my living room floor. As I checked my regulators, I could have sworn I heard something, a faint melody carried on the wind, like voices singing from very far away. But I told myself it was just nerves, just my imagination playing tricks. I'd done dozens of dives with Megan before, in caves and open water both. This would be no different. Just another day of field research, another line on my CV, another step toward finishing my degree. I was wrong, so terribly, catastrophically wrong. We arrived at Ridley Creek State Park just as dawn was breaking on March 23rd. The early spring air was crisp, with frost still clinging to the grass in shaded areas. The park was deserted at that hour. No joggers, no families, no other divers. Just 3 graduate students with too much equipment and too little common sense. The location Megan had chosen wasn't one of the regular diving spots. We had to hike half a mile from the parking area, following a barely visible trail through dense undergrowth. The weight of our gear made the journey exhausting, and by the time we reached the water's edge, we were all sweating despite the cold. "This is it," Megan said, pointing to a section of the creek where the water widened into a deep pool. Limestone cliffs rose on either side, creating a natural amphitheater. The surface of the water was mirror smooth, reflecting the grey morning sky like polished obsidian. As we set up our equipment, I noticed something odd about the air around us. It seemed heavier somehow, charged with an electric tension that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The usual morning sounds, birds, insects, the rustle of leaves, seemed muted, as if something was dampening them. Kim noticed it too. "It's too quiet," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where are all the birds?" Megan was too busy checking her camera settings to pay attention. She'd brought along some serious equipment, underwater lights that could illuminate half the creek, a high-resolution video camera, and enough backup batteries to power a small village. We did our buddy checks with practiced efficiency, though I insisted on triple-checking everything. Something about this place made me want to be absolutely certain nothing could go wrong. The water temperature was 48 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to require our thick wetsuits, but manageable for the hour-long dive we had planned. "Remember," Megan said as we prepared to enter the water, "we're looking for an opening in the cliff face about 30 feet down. The local divers said it's marked with unusual carvings. Once we find it, we'll document everything but touch nothing. Standard archaeological diving protocols." I nodded, but my attention was caught by something else, a pattern in the limestone cliff that I hadn't noticed before. It looked almost like writing, but not in any alphabet I recognized. The marks were weathered, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. "Megan," I called out, "you should see this," but she was already in the water, her bright yellow fins disappearing beneath the surface. Kim gave me a questioning look, but I just shook my head. We had a dive plan to follow. The strange markings could wait. As I slipped beneath the surface, the cold water shocking despite my wetsuit, I couldn't shake the feeling that those ancient marks weren't just writing, they were a warning. And we were about to find out why. The first 15 minutes of the dive went exactly according to plan. We descended in formation. Megan in the lead, Kim slightly behind and to her right, me bringing up the rear. Our lights cut through the murk, revealing a landscape that seemed to belong to another world entirely. The underwater topography of Ridley Creek was nothing like what I'd expected. Instead of the gentle slopes and scattered rocks typical of the area, we found ourselves swimming through what appeared to be intentionally carved channels. The limestone walls were too regular, too purposeful to be natural formations. At 25 feet, the water clarity improved dramatically. It was as if we'd passed through a thermocline, but instead of a temperature change, we'd crossed some invisible boundary between the modern world and something much, much older. That's when we saw it, the entrance Megan had been looking for. But entrance doesn't really capture what we found. It was more like a doorway, a perfect arch cut into the living rock. The sides were covered in those same strange symbols I'd noticed above water. But down here they were pristine, untouched by centuries of weathering. Megan was already swimming toward it, her camera flashing as she documented every detail. Kim moved to follow, but I grabbed her fin, holding her back. Something about the doorway seemed wrong. The water flowing through it moved in impossible ways, creating currents that didn't follow any natural pattern I'd ever studied. I flashed my light at Megan, giving her our signal for caution. She responded with an okay sign and kept swimming. The beam of her light disappeared into the darkness beyond the arch, and for a moment I thought I saw something move in the shadows behind her, something that shouldn't have been there. Kim must have seen it too, because she suddenly gripped my arm so hard I could feel it through my wetsuit. I flashed my light where she was pointing, but there was nothing there. Just the endless dark of the tunnel, swallowing Megan's light like a hungry mouth. We had no choice but to follow. The alternative was breaking our most fundamental rule, never leave your dive buddy. So we swam through the arch, passing beneath those ancient symbols, and into a chamber that defied everything I thought I knew about underwater cave systems in Pennsylvania. The space was enormous, far larger than should have been possible given the local geology. Our lights revealed walls that rose at least 50 feet above us, meeting in a dome that seemed to pulse with a faint, phosphorescent glow. But it wasn't the size of the chamber that made my heart stop. It was what we found inside it. The chamber was filled with ruins, but not the kind we'd expected to find. These weren't the remains of colonial structures or Native American settlements. These were buildings of a sort I'd never seen before, geometric shapes that hurt my eyes to look at directly, constructed from some material that seemed to absorb our light rather than reflect it. Megan was already examining one of the structures, her camera working overtime to capture every detail. I wanted to signal her to stop, to pull back and regroup, but before I could move, I saw it again, that movement in the shadows, more distinct this time. It started as a shimmer, like heat waves rising from hot pavement, but it quickly resolved into something solid, something impossible. The figure was humanoid from the waist up, with pale skin that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Long, dark hair floated around its head like a crown of serpents. But below the waist, I felt my mind trying to reject what I was seeing. Where legs should have been, there was a long, sinuous tail covered in scales that shifted color as it moved, from deepest black to iridescent blue-green. But it was the creature's face that made me forget everything I knew about dive safety and proper breathing techniques. Its eyes were huge, almost luminous, with no pupils or irises, just solid, pale blue orbs that fixed on us with terrifying intelligence. Its mouth was filled with teeth that resembled those of deep-sea predators. Row upon row of needle-sharp points. Kim was frantically tugging at my arm, trying to get my attention, but I couldn't look away from the creature. More of them were emerging from the shadows now, gliding through the water with impossible grace. I counted 5, then 7, then lost count as they began to circle us. Megan had finally noticed them. She'd stopped filming and was slowly backing away toward us, her movements careful and controlled. But I could see the panic in her eyes behind her mask. We all knew our situation was desperately wrong. Then one of the creatures opened its mouth and I heard it. The same melody I'd thought I'd imagined the night before, but stronger now, clearer. It wasn't coming through the water. It was somehow being transmitted directly into my mind. The song spoke of ancient things, of secrets hidden in the deep places of the world, of a hunger that could never be satisfied. That's when they attacked. Everything happened so fast, yet each moment is burned into my memory with horrifying clarity. The creatures moved with explosive speed, their tails propelling them through the water faster than any human could hope to swim. They went for Kim first. 2 of them grabbed her arms, while a third tore away her regulator. I saw her eyes go wide with terror as water rushed into her mouth. I tried to reach her, but more of them surrounded me, their cold hands gripping my arms, my legs, my tank. Megan was screaming through her regulator, the sound distorted by the water into something inhuman. She had managed to draw her diving knife and was slashing wildly at the creatures, but their skins seemed to absorb the blade's impact without damage. I watched in horror as they dragged Kim deeper into the chamber toward one of those impossible buildings. Her struggles were already weakening, her movements becoming sluggish as the lack of oxygen took its toll. I fought against the creatures holding me, but their strength was incredible. The song in my head was growing stronger, drowning out everything else. It promised answers to questions I'd never thought to ask, knowledge that no human was meant to possess. Part of me wanted to listen, to let go and sink into those ancient mysteries. That's when I remembered the magnesium torch in my belt pocket, an old-school piece of emergency equipment that I'd always carried but never expected to use. With my left hand, I managed to grab it and strike the igniter. The flash was blinding, even underwater. The creatures holding me recoiled, their song turning into a shriek of pain that threatened to split my skull. In that moment of confusion, I broke free. Through the spots dancing in my vision, I saw Megan doing the same, kicking hard toward the arch we'd entered through. But Kim was gone. The last glimpse I had of her was her limp form being carried into the darkness by those pale, terrible hands. I wanted to go after her, but Megan grabbed my arm and yanked me toward the exit. The rational part of my brain knew she was right. We couldn't help Kim if we died too. So we fled, swimming faster than I'd ever thought possible, driven by pure terror. The creatures didn't follow us into the main channel, but their song pursued us all the way to the surface, a melody of loss and ancient hunger that I knew would haunt my dreams forever. We burst through the surface of the creek like creatures possessed, clawing our way onto the rocky shore with desperate strength. Megan immediately ripped off her mask and vomited water and bile onto the stones. I couldn't stop shaking, my whole body trembling with adrenaline and horror. The sun was still high in the sky. We'd only been underwater for 45 minutes, though it felt like hours. The normal sounds of the park had returned. Birds singing, leaves rustling, the gentle flow of the creek. It all seemed obscene after what we'd witnessed. We have to call someone, Megan gasped between heaving breaths. Police, park rangers, Coast Guard, everyone. We have to get Kim back. But we both knew it was too late. Even if Kim had somehow survived the initial attack, no human could have lasted this long underwater. The knowledge sat between us like a physical weight, crushing our hearts with guilt and grief. I found my phone in my dive bag and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. How do you report something like this? What do you say to make them believe you? The operator's voice was calm, professional. 911, what's your emergency? There's been a diving accident at Ridley Creek State Park, I heard myself say. We need rescue teams, police, everyone you can send. Our friend, she's still down there. Stay calm, sir. Can you give me your exact location? I described where we were as best I could, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her about the creatures, about the ruins, about the song that was still echoing in my head. They wouldn't believe us. How could they? The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Park rangers arrived first, then state police, then a dive rescue team. They questioned us separately, their faces growing increasingly skeptical as we told our stories. Yes, we'd gone diving without proper permits. Yes, we'd entered an unmarked cave system. No, we couldn't explain exactly what had happened to Kim. I could see them forming their own narrative. Inexperienced divers, poor planning, tragic accident. They searched the water for hours, but found nothing. No sign of Kim, no evidence of the ruins, no trace of the creatures that had taken her. When they finally let us go, the sun was setting. Megan hadn't spoken for hours, her face blank with shock. I drove her home in silence, neither of us knowing what to say. What could we say? We'd lost our friend to something that shouldn't exist, something that defied everything we thought we knew about the world. But the worst part wasn't the disbelief of the authorities or the guilt of surviving. The worst part was knowing they were still down there, singing their ancient songs, waiting for more curious souls to venture into their domain. The weeks that followed were a nightmare of police interviews, psychological evaluations, and academic disciplinary hearings. The university suspended our research privileges pending a full investigation. Kim's parents hired lawyers, demanding answers we couldn't give. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those pale faces in the darkness, those inhuman eyes staring into my soul. But worse than the visions was the song. It never really went away. It just lurked at the edges of my consciousness, growing stronger at night. I tried to research the history of Ridley Creek, spending countless hours in the library and online. I found old newspaper articles about mysterious disappearances in the park, dating back to the 1800s. I discovered Native American legends about water spirits that lured people to their doom, but nothing that explained what we'd seen. Megan withdrew completely. She stopped coming to campus, stopped answering calls and texts. When I finally went to her apartment to check on her, I found the walls covered in drawings, hundreds of them, all showing those geometric ruins and the creatures that guarded them. In some of the drawings, the creatures had Kim's face. I tried to convince her to get help, but she just looked at me with empty eyes and said, "They're calling us back, Sam. Can't you hear them? They're getting louder." She was right. The song was growing stronger, more insistent. I started hearing it even during the day, its melody weaving through the normal sounds of life like a poison thread. I would find myself driving toward the park without meaning to, drawn by that otherworldly music. One night, about a month after the incident, Megan called me at 3 a.m. Her voice was distant, dreamy, almost peaceful. I figured it out. "Sam," she said, "the symbols, the ruins, everything. They're not just ruins. They're a city. Their city, and they want to show us all of it. Megan, where are you?" My heart was pounding. I already knew the answer, but I had to ask. "Where we belong," she whispered. "Come join us. Kim is here. She's learning so much." The line went dead. I threw on clothes and ran to my car, driving well above the speed limit toward Ridley Creek. The song in my head was deafening now, a symphony of alien voices that made it hard to think straight. Part of me wanted to give in, to let it guide me back to those dark waters. But I remembered Kim's face as they dragged her away, and that memory helped me fight the compulsion. I found Megan's car in the parking lot, her clothes neatly folded on the front seat. Her diving gear was gone. I called 911 again, but I knew it was useless. By the time the police arrived, there would be nothing left to find, just like with Kim. That night changed everything. I couldn't pretend anymore that what had happened was some kind of shared hallucination or trauma-induced delusion. The creatures were real, and they were patient, and they were hungry, not for our flesh, but for something else, something deeper. It's been 6 months since I lost both my friends to the things in Ridley Creek. I've tried everything to escape their influence, moved to a different state, sought psychiatric help, even tried experimental treatments to block the music in my head. Nothing works. The song follows me everywhere. It's in my dreams, in the wind, in the sound of running water. Sometimes I wake up to find my sheets soaking wet, as if I've been swimming in my sleep. My fingers are developing webs between them, and my eyes. My eyes are starting to change color. I know now why they let me escape that day. I wasn't rejected, I was chosen to be their herald, their witness. They wanted me to understand slowly, to change gradually, to learn to want what they were offering: knowledge, transformation, transcendence. The authorities have closed off that section of Ridley Creek State Park. They call it an environmental hazard, but the barriers they've erected won't stop what's coming. The city down there is just one outpost of something much larger, much older. The creatures, I know what they really are now, but there's no word for it in any human language, have been here longer than us. They'll be here long after we're gone. Last night, I found more of those symbols carved into my bathroom mirror, appearing in the steam like a message from the deep. I understood them perfectly. They're an invitation, just like the ones that brought Megan and Kim home. I'm writing this account as a warning, but also as an explanation. By the time anyone reads this, I'll be gone. Not dead, something else entirely. The webbing between my fingers is almost complete now, and when I sing in the shower, my voice carries harmonics that make the pipes rattle. I've booked a room at a small motel near Ridley Creek State Park. I've left instructions for my possessions to be donated to charity. Some will say I've committed suicide, driven mad by guilt and grief over losing my friends. Others might guess closer to the truth, but dismiss it as impossible. To anyone who finds this, if you hear singing in the water, if you dream of ruins that don't follow the laws of geometry, if you find yourself drawn to dark places where the surface world feels like a distant memory, run. Run as far and as fast as you can, but know this, you can't run forever. The song will find you, it always does. And somewhere in the depths of Ridley Creek, in a city that shouldn't exist, 3 graduate students who used to be human are swimming through ancient corridors, learning secrets that mortal minds were never meant to know, adding their voices to a chorus that's as old as the oceans themselves. The water is calling, and I'm finally ready to answer. Growing up in Millerton, Pennsylvania, a town where everyone knew your business before you did, freedom was something I measured in miles. Specifically, how many miles I could put between myself and Main Street on any given weekend. My name is Adrian Torres, and in 2003, I was 19 years old working at Riley's Diner and living in that strange liminal space between childhood and adulthood, where everything seems both possible and precarious. Riley's wasn't much to look at. Just another small-town diner with vinyl booths worn smooth by decades of use, and a kitchen that perpetually smelled of burned coffee and maple syrup. I spent my days in the back, up to my elbows in greasy dishwater, watching plates come in bearing the half-eaten remains of other people's lives. The work was mindless, but it paid enough to fuel my real passion, exploration. That passion had a physical form, a 1989 Ford Bronco that I'd bought from old Mr. Henderson out on Route 16. I remember the day I first saw it, sitting in his front yard with weeds growing up around the tires and a "for sale" sign taped to the windshield. The paint was faded to a sort of washed-out blue, like a pair of old jeans that had been left in the sun too long. The wheel wells showed spots of rust, and the interior smelled like hay and leather and old cigarettes. But none of that mattered because it had four-wheel drive and a recently rebuilt engine. Mr. Henderson had used it mainly for farm work, hauling feed and equipment around his property. He was asking $3,500, but I managed to talk him down to $2,800, every penny I'd saved from 6 months of washing dishes and living on ramen noodles. Spent the next few months pouring every spare dollar and minute into that truck. I added off-road lights, bolted a winch to the front bumper, and installed bigger tires that made it sit higher off the ground. The previous owner had already reinforced the frame and added heavy-duty shocks, making it perfect for the kind of exploring I had in mind. The crown jewel was the stereo system, a Pioneer head unit with speakers powerful enough to rattle the windows when I cranked up my favorite punk bands. My parents thought I was crazy to spend so much money on an old truck. My father, who'd worked at the same insurance office for 20 years, kept trying to convince me to put the money in a savings account instead. "You need to think about your future," he'd say over dinner, while my mother nodded in agreement. But they didn't understand. In Militon, your future was something that happened to you, not something you chose. I wanted more than that. The diner became my base of operations. Between shifts, I'd spread maps across the break room table, marking potential routes and destinations. The other employees thought I was odd, especially Marie, the 60-year-old waitress who'd been there since before I was born. She'd catch me studying the topographical lines and shake her head. "You're gonna get yourself killed out there," she'd say, but there was a hint of envy in her voice, like she remembered what it felt like to want something more than this town could offer. I started small at first, day trips to nearby state parks, careful explorations of marked trails. But gradually, I began pushing further, seeking out the places that didn't show up in tourist guides. I discovered old logging roads that hadn't seen traffic in decades, abandoned quarries where the walls still bore the marks of century-old dynamite blasts, and forgotten cemeteries hidden in the woods where the headstones had become illegible with age. Each trip taught me something new. I learned how to read the land, how to tell which paths were safe and which might leave me stranded miles from help. I learned about tire pressure and approach angles, about the importance of carrying extra fuel and knowing how to change a serpentine belt in the middle of nowhere. But most importantly, I learned that there were still places in the world that felt untouched, uncharted, waiting to be discovered. I kept a journal of my explorations, filling it with detailed notes about the routes I'd taken and the things I'd found. Looking back at those entries now, I can see the progression, how each successful trip made me a little more confident, a little more willing to push the boundaries of what I thought was possible. That confidence would eventually lead me to that creek on that October night, but at the time, it felt like I was invincible. The Bronco became more than just a vehicle. It was my ticket to freedom, my escape pod from the gravitational pull of small-town life. Every paycheck was divided between necessities and improvements for the truck. I learned to do most of the maintenance myself, spending weekends under the hood with a Haynes manual propped open nearby. The smell of motor oil became as familiar as the scent of dish soap, and my hands bore the marks of both professions, pruned from dishwater and scraped from working with tools. That fateful Friday, October 24th, 2003, began like any other day at Riley's Diner. But there was something different in the air, a kind of electric anticipation that made the hours drag by with excruciating slowness. The autumn wind rattled the windows of the kitchen, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. It was the kind of day that seemed to whisper of adventures waiting just beyond the horizon. I spent most of my shift watching the sky through the kitchen's small window, tracking the sun's descent behind the mountains that bordered our town. The usual Friday rush had come and gone, locals grabbing dinner before the high school's homecoming game, the same ritual that had been playing out in Millerton for generations. Their voices drifted back to me through the steam of the dishwasher, talking about touchdowns and dress colors and all the small dramas that seemed to matter so much in a town like ours. The kitchen radio crackled with news about an incoming cold front, the weatherman's voice competing with the clatter of plates and the hiss of the grill. Tommy, our short-order cook who'd been at Riley's longer than I'd been alive, shot me one of his knowing looks as I checked my watch for the 100th time. "Got plans tonight, kid?" he asked, flipping burgers with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it so many times they could do it in their sleep. Tommy understood my wanderlust better than most. He'd been a long-haul trucker before settling down in Millerton, and sometimes he'd tell stories about the strange things he'd seen on America's back roads late at night. "Maybe," I replied, trying to sound casual as I scrubbed at a particularly stubborn patch of dried egg. "Found some interesting roads up in Morgan County I thought I might check out." Tommy's spatula paused mid-flip. "Morgan County? Up near the old logging camps?" He frowned, the fluorescent kitchen lights deepening the creases around his eyes. "Be careful up there, Adrian. Those roads ain't maintained like they used to be. Plus," he hesitated, something unusual crossing his weathered face. "Plus what?" "Nothing," he shrugged, turning back to his grill. "Just stories my granddaddy used to tell. Old timberworker tales about things in those woods. Probably just meant to scare kids away from dangerous areas." I wanted to press him for details, but the ticket printer started chattering with new orders, and the moment was lost in the rush of Friday night business. Still, his words stuck with me, adding another layer of intrigue to my planned expedition. By the time my shift ended at 8 p.m., the dining room had emptied out, everyone heading to the football stadium where the lights blazed against the darkening sky. I changed out of my grease-stained work clothes in the employee bathroom, pulling on thick jeans, a flannel shirt, and my trusty Red Wing boots, proper exploring clothes. The maps I'd been studying were spread across the break room table, their creases worn soft from frequent handling. These weren't your standard road maps. They were USGS topographical quadrangles from the 1970s, showing details that newer maps often omitted: old mining trails, abandoned railroad grade, seasonal streams, and the locations of structures that might not even exist anymore. I'd been particularly interested in one area where several old logging roads converged, near what the map labeled as Stillwater Creek. The name itself was interesting. Most creeks in the area had prosaic names like North Branch or were simply numbered. But Stillwater Creek seemed to appear out of nowhere in the mountains and disappear just as mysteriously a few miles later. Marie came in as I was folding the maps, her order pad stuck in the pocket of her coffee-stained apron. "You heading out to those woods again?" she asked, reaching past me to grab her purse from the employee lockers. "You know, when I was young, my father used to work up in those logging camps. He wouldn't talk about it much, but sometimes, after a few drinks, he'd mention things." She trailed off, shaking her head. "What kind of things?" I asked, suddenly curious about this second cryptic warning in one night. "Oh, just nonsense, really. Stories about lights where there shouldn't be any, sounds that couldn't be explained. The kind of tales lonely men tell when they're too long in the woods." She patted my arm. "Just be careful, sweetheart. Those mountains can play tricks on your mind after dark." I thanked her for her concern, but internally I was dismissing it as more small-town superstition. Every rural area had its stories. I'd grown up hearing tales of phantom hitchhikers, mysterious lights, and creatures lurking in the shadows. They were just ways people tried to make sense of the darkness, to put names to the ancient fears that still lurked in our collective unconscious. The quick stop on Main Street was my last stop before heading out. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I loaded up on supplies, energy drinks, beef jerky, trail mix, and enough fuel to fill both my truck's tank and the 5-gallon jerry can I kept for emergencies. Mrs. Reeves was working the register, as she seemed to do every Friday night, her grey hair pulled back in a tight bun. "You're heading out awful late," she commented as she rang up my purchases. Through the store's large windows, I could see my Bronco waiting in the parking lot, the extra lights I'd mounted on the roll bar gleaming dully in the streetlight. "Best time for exploring," I replied, counting out bills from my week's pay. "Less traffic, more adventure." She made that clucking sound that older women seem to perfect, the one that manages to convey both disapproval and resignation. "Adventure," he says. "You know my Herbert used to work security up at those old logging camps back in the 80s when they were shutting everything down. He'd come home sometimes looking like he'd seen a ghost. Said there were things up there that didn't show up on any inventory list, things the company wanted to pretend didn't exist." That caught my attention. "What kind of things?" But she just waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, who knows? Herbert always did have an active imagination. Just be careful up there, honey. Some places, they don't take kindly to visitors after dark." The sun had fully surrendered to the night by the time I pulled out of the Quick Stop's parking lot. Main Street was nearly deserted, most of the town either at the football game or home for the evening. The old clock on the courthouse tower showed 8:45 p.m. as I passed, its face glowing a pale green in the darkness. The Bronco's engine settled into a comfortable rumble as I turned east onto Route 16, leaving the warm glow of Millerton behind. The truck's modified suspension absorbed the road's imperfections, each mile taking me further from the familiar and deeper into the embrace of the October night. I'd loaded up my favorite playlist, a mix of punk and metal that seemed appropriate for solo night adventures, but found myself turning it down as the darkness deepened, as if some primitive part of my brain wanted to stay alert to the sounds of the wilderness. The transformation of the landscape was gradual but distinct. First came the transitional zone, where suburban dreams met rural reality. Abandoned gas stations with faded signs, mobile homes set far back from the road, their windows glowing with blue TV light. Then the buildings became more scattered, replaced by fields that stretched into the darkness like black oceans. The few houses I passed were old farmsteads, their walls weathered by decades of storms and neglect. My headlights caught occasional glimpses of wildlife, deer frozen in mid-stride, their eyes reflecting back like dying stars. And once, a massive owl that swooped across the road with silent wings. The moon was rising now, a bloated orange disk that seemed too large to be real, its light casting strange shadows across the landscape. I'd marked my route carefully on the maps, which were now spread across the passenger seat. The old logging roads I was aiming for weren't marked on any modern GPS. They dated back to the 1950s, when the timber companies were still actively harvesting these hills. According to my research, which consisted mainly of late-night conversations with old-timers at the diner and hours spent in the local library's historical archives, the logging operations had ceased suddenly in 1963. The official reason was economic. The easily accessible timber had been harvested, and the remaining stands weren't worth the effort. But I'd found hints of other stories in the newspaper archives, vague references to incidents and unexplained events that had never been fully explained. The pavement ended about 2 hours into my drive, right where my maps indicated it would. I pulled over, the Bronco's engine ticking as it cooled, and stepped out to engage the four-wheel drive hubs. The night air was crisp enough to make me grateful for the heavy flannel shirt I'd worn, carrying scents that seemed to bypass my conscious mind and speak directly to something older, something that remembered when humans were not the dominant species on Earth. The silence was absolute. No distant traffic noise, no hum of power lines, not even the usual chorus of crickets and frogs. Just the soft whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional creak of branches overhead. I checked my watch, 10:47 p.m. The football game would be over by now, its drama already fading into local legend. Here, different rules applied. The gravel road that led into the hills was barely visible in the moonlight, more suggested than seen. My maps showed it connecting to the old logging network about 3 miles ahead, but the condition of the road made me question the accuracy of that information. Nature had been working for decades to reclaim this path. Small landslides had eaten away at the edges, and in places, trees had grown so close to the road that their branches scraped against the Bronco's sides like grasping fingers. I'd read an article once about how darkness changes human psychology, how it triggers ancient survival instincts that our ancestors developed when they weren't at the top of the food chain. In the darkness, every shadow could hide a predator. Every unexpected sound could signal danger. The article suggested that these instincts were vestigial, no longer necessary in our modern world. But as I guided the Bronco deeper into the hills, those instincts felt anything but vestigial. The darkness seemed to press against the windows, thick and alive, making the bubble of light from my headlights feel impossibly fragile. The truck's engine, which I'd maintained meticulously, developed a slight miss that I'd never heard before, as if it was struggling against something more than just gravity and friction. The road climbed steadily, switching back on itself as it followed the contours of the hills. My map showed an elevation gain of nearly 2,000 feet over the next few miles, but numbers on paper couldn't capture the feeling of ascending into darkness, of leaving the known world behind. The trees changed as I climbed, the familiar maples and oaks giving way to older, darker growth. Pine and hemlock loomed overhead, their branches forming a tunnel that seemed to swallow my headlights. At one particularly sharp turn, I caught a glimpse of Millerton in the valley far below. The town's lights made a small pool of warmth in the vast darkness, already seeming impossibly distant. I thought about Tommy's warning, about Mrs. Reeves's strange comments regarding her husband's experiences in these hills. It would have been easy to turn back then, to return to the safety of the known world. But something pushed me forward. Maybe curiosity, maybe pride, or maybe something else, something that had been waiting for this night, drawing me up into these hills like a fish being reeled in on an invisible line. The Bronco's engine growled as I shifted into a lower gear, the sound echoing off the hillsides in a way that made it seem like something was answering from the darkness. The gravel road eventually leveled out onto what my maps identified as Timber Ridge, though any signs that might have once confirmed this had long since vanished. The moon had risen high enough now to cast an eerie blue-white light through the trees, creating patterns on the road that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of my eye. It was here, on Timber Ridge, that I made a decision that would alter the course of my life. The moon's brightness had given me an idea, something I'd read about in an off-road magazine but had never dared to try: night driving without headlights. The article had described it as a way to truly experience the wilderness, to let your eyes adjust to the natural light and become one with the terrain. I eased the Bronco to a stop and killed the engine. The sudden silence was like a physical presence pressing against my eardrums. I sat there for a few minutes, letting my eyes adjust to the moonlight while watching the temperature gauge's needle slowly sink toward cool. The dashboard clock's red LED display read 11:23 p.m. When I finally stepped out of the truck, the night air hit me like a splash of cold water. Up here, nearly 2,000 feet higher than Millerton, the temperature had dropped significantly. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost was already starting to form on the Bronco's hood. But it wasn't just the cold that made me shiver. There was something else, something in the quality of the silence that seemed fundamentally wrong. In normal wilderness silence, you can still hear things: the rustle of small animals, the movement of branches in the wind, the distant calls of nocturnal birds. But here on this ridgetop there was nothing. It was as if something had muted the forest, turned down the volume of reality itself. Even my footsteps on the gravel seemed oddly muffled, like I was walking on cotton instead of stone. The moon cast enough light to see clearly, transforming the landscape into a monochromatic painting of silver and shadow. The trees along the road were old-growth hemlocks, their branches reaching across the sky like gnarled fingers. Their trunks were massive, 4 or 5 feet in diameter at least, suggesting they'd somehow escaped the logging operations that had cleared most of these hills 60 years ago. I walked a little way ahead of the truck, testing my night vision. The road was fairly straight here, following the ridge's spine, and I could see perhaps a quarter-mile ahead where it began to descend again. According to my maps, Stillwater Creek lay in the valley below, though from this height I couldn't hear any sound of running water. Back in the truck, I left the headlights off and started the engine. The Bronco's rumble seemed impossibly loud in the unnatural silence, and I found myself wincing as if I'd just shouted in a church. But as I began to drive, I discovered the magazine article had been right. There was something intensely intimate about navigating by moonlight alone. The landscape took on a dreamlike quality, every shadow and silvery highlight holding potential meaning. I drove this way for perhaps 20 minutes, maintaining a careful speed of around 15 miles per hour. The road began to descend, switching back on itself as it followed the contours of the hill. The trees pressed closer here, their branches occasionally scraping against the truck's roof with a sound like fingernails on metal. The temperature continued to drop, and I noticed frost forming patterns on the inside of the windshield, despite having the defroster on full blast. The first sign that I was approaching Stillwater Creek was a change in the air, a dampness that carried the scent of wet stone and rotting leaves. Then I began to hear it, a low murmur that gradually resolved into the sound of moving water. The road made one final turn, and suddenly I was facing the creek crossing. I switched the headlights back on, more out of instinct than conscious decision. The beams cut through the darkness to illuminate a scene that immediately set off warning bells in my mind. The creek was much wider than the map had suggested, swollen by recent rains into something that looked more like a small river. The surface of the water was black in the moonlight, moving with a purpose that seemed almost conscious. The crossing point was marked by the remains of an old concrete ford, a low-water bridge that had partially collapsed, creating a series of rapids that churned the water into foam. On the far bank, barely visible in the shadows, stood what appeared to be an old survey marker or warning sign. Though I couldn't make out any writing on it from this distance, common sense would have told me to turn back. The water was clearly too deep, the current too strong for a safe crossing. But common sense wasn't my strong suit that night. Instead, I found myself reaching for the door handle, deciding to wade out and test the depth personally. After all, the Bronco had nearly 3 feet of clearance with its lift kit, and I'd made similar crossings before. The moment my boots touched the ground, something changed in the atmosphere. The air became noticeably heavier, as if the barometric pressure had suddenly dropped. My ears popped, and I felt a strange sensation in my chest, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air is charged with potential energy. I moved toward the water's edge, my boots crunching on a mixture of gravel and dead leaves. The bank was steeper than it had looked from the truck, dropping about 6 feet to where the black water slid past with hypnotic smoothness. I pulled out my LED flashlight, clicking it on to get a better look at the crossing. The beam revealed more details about the collapsed ford. What had once been a solid concrete structure had been undermined by years of flooding, creating a jumble of broken slabs that now served as improvised stepping stones. The water flowing between them was dark and clear, revealing glimpses of a rocky bottom, perhaps 2 feet below the surface. But something about the water's movement seemed off. In places, it appeared to flow upstream, creating small whirlpools that rotated against the current. I'd taken enough hydrology classes in college to know this wasn't normal. Water follows predictable patterns based on gradient and obstacles. What I was seeing defied those basic principles. I found a long branch and used it to probe the depth, moving carefully along the bank to find the best crossing point. The stick showed consistent readings of about 2 feet deep across most of the span. The Bronco could handle that easily. But each time I withdrew the branch, the water clung to it in an unusual way, seeming to resist letting go. That should have been my second warning. The first had been the unnatural silence, and now this. But I was 19, immortal in the way only teenagers can be, and determined to press on. I returned to the truck, my boots already muddy from the soft bank. The Bronco's engine was still running, its idle smooth and steady. I shifted into 4-wheel drive low, engaged the differential locks, and began to ease forward. The front tires dropped over the bank and into the water with a splash that seemed impossibly loud in the still night air. The crossing started well enough. The water was cold, but not deep enough to reach the doors, and the truck's big tires found purchase on the rocky bottom. I kept the speed steady, knowing that creating a bow wave would help keep water out of the engine. I was about halfway across when everything went wrong. The first sign of trouble was the headlights beginning to dim. Then the engine started to sputter, its rhythm becoming erratic. I pressed harder on the accelerator, trying to maintain momentum, but that only made things worse. Water was finding its way into systems that should have been waterproof, and the engine was drowning. The Bronco coughed once, twice, and died. In the sudden silence, I could hear water rushing around the truck's body, and something else, a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was like a whisper, but not in any language I'd ever heard. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then I felt the truck shift. At first I thought the current was pushing against the vehicle, but this was different. The Bronco began to tilt to the passenger side, not gradually, but with deliberate force, as if something was pushing against it. I slammed my foot on the brake pedal and pulled the parking brake lever, but it made no difference. The truck continued to move sideways, water now seeping in through the passenger side window seals. I tried to restart the engine, but the starter just made a wet clicking sound that spoke of flooded electronics. Through the passenger window, I could see something impossible. The water was moving wrong, forming patterns that water shouldn't make, swirling in designs that hurt my eyes to look at directly. And in those patterns, I caught glimpses of something moving, something large and utterly alien. The truck lurched again, this time more violently. Water began pouring in faster now, and I knew I had to get out. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the door handle, but finally it opened, letting in a rush of cold water that soaked my legs to the knees. I didn't even have time to grab my phone or the maps. Some deep, primitive part of my brain was screaming at me to move, to get away from whatever was in the water with me. I splashed toward the bank I'd come from, but my feet slipped on the mossy rocks, sending me face first into the creek. The water was shockingly cold, driving the air from my lungs. As I struggled to stand, my hand brushed against something in the water, something that felt like wet leather, but moved like muscle. I jerked away, but not before feeling it react to my touch, coiling around my wrist for just a moment before letting go. I scrambled backward, half swimming, half crawling toward the bank. My clothes were soaked through, making every movement feel like I was dragging lead weights. The moonlight that had seemed so bright before now revealed too much. Shadows moving against other shadows. Shapes that shouldn't exist twisting in the water around me. Behind me, I heard the Bronco's metal body groan under immense pressure. The sound was followed by a series of sharp pops as the windows began to crack. I reached the bank and started to pull myself up, my fingers digging into the cold mud when I heard it, a sound that my mind still refuses to properly process. It was like a voice, but not human, not animal either. It was deep and resonant, seeming to vibrate through the water and the ground, and my bones all at once. The closest comparison I can make is to imagine the sound a mountain would make if mountains could speak. But even that doesn't capture the alien quality of it. I made the mistake of looking back, The Bronco was being lifted out of the water, not by any mechanical means, but by something invisible. Water cascaded off the vehicle's body as it rose at least 3 feet into the air. Then, with deliberate slowness, it began to move toward the opposite bank. But what froze my blood wasn't the sight of my truck floating in midair. It was what I saw in the water beneath it. The moonlight caught something moving, something massive. The surface of the creek rippled and distorted, forming shapes that suggested a body larger than my truck. But whenever I tried to focus directly on it, it seemed to bend away from my vision, like trying to look at a blind spot in your eye. The only parts I could see clearly were the eyes. They appeared in the air about 7 feet above the water's surface, glowing with a pale yellowish light. They were huge, each one bigger than my fist and utterly inhuman. The pupils were vertical slits like a cat's, but they moved independently of each other, one fixing on me while the other scanned the surroundings. The voice came again, and this time I could feel it trying to form words. The water around me vibrated with the sound, creating patterns on the surface that looked disturbingly like writing in some ancient forgotten script. My head began to ache as my brain tried to process what I was seeing and hearing. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and clawed my way up the bank, my boots slipping in the mud, my clothes feeling like they weighed 100 pounds. Behind me, I heard a sound like rushing water, but magnified 1,000 times, as if the entire creek had suddenly decided to change direction. I ran. There's no heroic way to describe it, no way to dress it up as anything other than pure animal panic. My feet slipped on wet leaves and loose stones, my lungs burning with each breath of the cold night air. The sound of rushing water grew louder behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I could still feel those eyes, still sense them tracking my desperate flight up the bank. Halfway up, my foot caught on an exposed root, and I went down hard, my chin striking the ground with enough force to make my teeth clack together. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. I tried to get up, but my body seemed to have forgotten how legs worked. That's when I felt it, a change in the air pressure that made my ears pop painfully. The moonlight dimmed, as if something vast had moved between me and the sky. A shadow fell over me, but it wasn't a normal shadow. It seemed to have depth and texture, like looking into a pool of oil. And it was moving, flowing across the ground with purpose. I rolled onto my back, my hands scrabbling in the mud for anything I could use as a weapon. My fingers closed around a fallen branch, but I knew it would be useless against whatever was approaching. The air had become thick, making each breath feel like trying to inhale syrup. That's when I saw them again, those terrible yellow eyes, now directly above me. They hung in the darkness like twin moons, studying me with an intelligence that felt ancient and utterly alien. The thing they belonged to remained invisible, but I could sense its presence, could feel the weight of its attention like a physical pressure on my chest. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't just sound. Images began flooding into my mind. Impossible geometries, structures that couldn't exist in 3-dimensional space, creatures that moved between moments of time like we move between rooms. My nose started bleeding, warm drops falling onto my mud-covered shirt. Then something struck me across the face. Not a physical blow, but something worse. It felt like reality itself had reached out and slapped me, distorting my perception for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. I tasted colors, heard shapes, felt sounds crawling across my skin like insects. When my senses finally realigned themselves, I was alone on the bank. The shadow had vanished, taking those terrible eyes with it. But I could hear activity down by the creek, splashing sounds and the groan of stressed metal. My Bronco was being moved, though by what means I couldn't comprehend. I lay there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, waiting for my heart to stop trying to punch its way out of my chest. The night had become unnaturally quiet again, the only sound my own ragged breathing and the distant murmur of the creek. Dawn was still hours away when I heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. The mechanical growl of its engine was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. a sound that belonged to my world, to reality as I understood it. A spotlight swept across the trees, and then an ATV emerged from the darkness, driven by an older man in coveralls. He killed the engine and dismounted with the ease of someone who'd done it thousands of times before. His weathered face showed no surprise at finding a mud-covered teenager lying on the ground near his creek. If anything, he looked resigned, like he'd seen this scene play out before. "Tried to cross that creek, didn't you?" he asked, his voice carrying a thick local accent. There was something in his tone, not quite sympathy, but understanding. He reached down and hauled me to my feet with surprising strength for someone who couldn't have been much more than 5'8". The sudden change in position sent waves of pain through my body. Every muscle screamed in protest, and my head throbbed with a migraine that felt like it was trying to split my skull in two. I must have made some sort of noise, because the man's expression softened slightly. "Name's Vernon," he said, still holding onto my arm as if he wasn't sure I could stand on my own. "Own this property. Been waiting for someone to try crossing tonight." He glanced at the creek, then quickly looked away. "Full moon always brings 'em out." I tried to form words, to ask about what I'd seen, but my throat felt raw, as if I'd been screaming. Maybe I had been. Vernon seemed to understand anyway. "Best not to talk about it," he said quietly. "Them things, they don't like being noticed, don't like being remembered. Most folks who see 'em, their minds sort of—" He made a vague gesture with his free hand. "Smooth it over. Make it into something else, something they can live with." He helped me onto his ATV, and I noticed his hands were covered in old scars, long, straight lines that looked almost surgical in their precision. He caught me looking and pulled his sleeves down. "Used to work security up here, back when the timber company was still running," he explained as he started the engine. "Seen things that don't fit in any report, things that made good men quit and never come back to these hills." We rode in silence for a while, the ATV's headlight cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Every bump sent fresh waves of pain through my body, but I welcomed it. Pain meant I was still here, still in the world I knew. "Your truck's up ahead," Vernon said finally. "Found it on this side of the creek, pointed toward the road. They do that sometimes, move things around. Nobody knows why." Sure enough, the Bronco sat in the middle of the road, water still dripping from its frame. The moonlight revealed new dents in the metal, long, straight depressions that looked like finger marks pressed into clay. Except these were pressed into steel. Vernon helped me inspect the Bronco in the dim light of his ATV's headlamp. The damage was extensive but strangely precise. Those finger-like depressions ran along both sides of the vehicle, spaced about 8 inches apart. The passenger side was crushed inward, as if it had been squeezed by a giant hand. But what disturbed me most was the pattern etched into the hood, a series of overlapping circles and lines that seemed to shift and move when viewed from different angles. "Don't look at those marks too long," Vernon warned, pulling me back. "They'll give you headaches that no medicine can cure." He was right. My temples were already throbbing from the few seconds I'd spent studying the pattern. I turned away, fighting down a wave of nausea. "Got a friend with a tow truck," Vernon said, pulling an ancient flip phone from his coveralls. "Greg, he's used to special cases like this. Won't ask too many questions." He paused, looking at me carefully. "You got someone you can call?" I thought about my parents, about trying to explain what had happened. The idea seemed impossible. How could I describe something I barely understood myself? Even now, less than an hour after it happened, my mind was trying to rationalize what I'd seen, to file it away as something explainable, a trick of light, an hallucination brought on by fear and cold. But the dents in my truck told a different story. They were real, physical evidence of something that shouldn't exist. "I'll figure something out," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. Vernon nodded and made the call. While we waited for Greg, he told me more about the creek and its history. He spoke in a low, matter-of-fact tone, as if discussing weather patterns or crop rotation. "Been here longer than anyone knows," he said. "The logging company found things when they first started cutting. structures deep in the woods that weren't built by any human hands. They tried to keep it quiet, but word got out. People went missing. Equipment would be found miles from where it was left, twisted into shapes that metal shouldn't be able to make. He lit a cigarette, the flame from his lighter casting strange shadows across his face. Company shut everything down in '63 after what happened to the night crew at Camp 7. Officially, it was an equipment malfunction. Unofficially, he shook his head. Let's just say there's a reason no one comes up here after dark anymore. No one except kids like you who don't know any better. Greg arrived just as the eastern sky was beginning to lighten. His tow truck was older than I was. Its red paint faded to a dull pink. He was a huge man with hands like baseball mitts, but he moved with a careful precision as he hooked up my truck. Neither Greg nor Vernon spoke as they worked. They moved with the synchronized efficiency of people who had done this many times before. I stood back, shivering in my still damp clothes, watching as my pride and joy was winched onto the flatbed. "Where to?" Greg asked when they were done. His voice was surprisingly soft for such a big man. I gave him the address of a repair shop in Millerton, one I'd used before. He nodded and handed me a business card that was worn smooth around the edges. "Call them tomorrow," he said. "Tell them Greg sent you. They'll know what to do." Vernon offered me a ride back to town on his ATV. As we prepared to leave, Greg pulled me aside. "Word of advice," he said quietly. "Don't try to fix those dents. Cover them up if you want, but don't try to pound them out. Let's just say they're more than just damaged metal." The next few weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and increasingly strange occurrences. I told my parents I'd hit a deer, which explained both the damage to the truck and my injured state. They believed me, or pretended to. It was easier than the truth. The repair shop Greg recommended turned out to be a small operation run by an elderly woman named May Chen. She took one look at the Bronco and ushered me into her office, closing the door behind us. "Vernon called ahead," she said, settling behind a desk cluttered with old service manuals and strange mechanical components I didn't recognize. "Said you had an encounter at Stillwater Creek." May didn't just fix vehicles. She helped people who'd had encounters like mine. She explained that the marks on my truck weren't just damage. They were a kind of language, a message left by whatever dwelled in those waters. She covered them with special plates she kept in a locked room behind her shop, plates inscribed with symbols that made my eyes hurt to look at. But it was already too late. The changes had begun. I started hearing things, whispers in running water, songs in the rain that fell against my window at night. My dreams were filled with those impossible geometric shapes I'd seen in my mind during the encounter. And sometimes I'd wake to find my sheets soaking wet. Though my windows were closed, the worst part was the pull. Every full moon, I felt an overwhelming urge to return to Stillwater Creek. It was like a physical tug in my chest, drawing me back to those dark waters. I fought it, but each month it grew stronger. It's been 6 months since that night. I'm writing this as a warning, but also as a confession. The changes are accelerating now. Last week, I noticed webbing starting to form between my fingers. When I look in the mirror, my eyes seem different. The pupils slightly elongated, the irises taking on a yellowish tinge. May says there are others like me, people who've been marked by the creek. Some fight it, living half-lives trapped between two worlds. Others embrace the change, disappearing into the dark waters, never to be seen again. Tonight is another full moon, and I've made my decision. The pull is too strong to resist anymore. I can hear the creek calling, its song more beautiful and terrible than ever. My truck sits in the driveway, those metal plates still covering the messages left in its skin. I won't need it where I'm going. To anyone who finds this, if you're driving through Morgan County late at night and you come across a creek that seems too dark, too quiet, too wrong, turn back. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed. Some waters aren't meant for human passage. And if you hear singing in the rain, if you see shapes moving in puddles that shouldn't be there, If you feel something watching you from the depths of every body of water you pass, remember my story. Remember that there are things in this world older than humanity, things that wait in the dark waters, patient and hungry for change. The creek is calling, and I must answer. The cornfields of western Iowa have a way of playing tricks on your mind after dark. In the daytime, they're just fields, endless rows of green in summer, golden brown in fall. But at night, especially along the Nebraska border where the hills start to roll and the forests creep in between the farmland, those fields become something else entirely. The corn whispers secrets to itself in the wind, and the shadows between the rows seem to move with purpose. I'm Blake Weber, and I've lived in Harrison County my entire life. 23 years of watching the seasons change, watching farms get passed down or sold off, watching the small towns either adapt or slowly die. I thought I knew every strange thing these borderlands could throw at me. I was wrong. It started in August 2021, during one of those sticky Midwestern nights where the air feels like warm syrup and thunder grumbles in the distance without ever delivering rain. My best friend Derek Mitchell had called around 1:30 a.m., asking for a ride home from a party out at the old Peterson place. I didn't mind. I was still up working on my truck, a '98 Ford F-150 that I'd just finished repainting. The front bumper had taken me 3 weekends to get right, and I was pretty proud of how it turned out. The Peterson farm sat about 15 miles outside of town, tucked into one of those pockets where the GPS gets confused and cell service becomes theoretical. Getting there meant navigating a maze of gravel roads with names like 260th Street and Maple Road, though I'd never seen a maple tree anywhere near them. The roads out there follow property lines laid down in the 1800s, creating a grid that looks neat on maps, but feels like a labyrinth when you're actually driving it. Derek was waiting at the end of the Petersons' long gravel driveway when I pulled up. The party was still going strong. I could hear music thumping from the barn they'd converted into a sort of rural dance club, and shapes moved in front of the outdoor lights like moths around a flame. Derek climbed into the passenger seat, bringing with him the smell of cheap beer and bonfire smoke. "Thanks for coming, man," he said, slumping against the window. I was not about to sleep in my car again. I noticed he was more coherent than I'd expected, given the hour and the occasion. Derek wasn't a heavy drinker. He'd learned that lesson sophomore year of high school when his dad caught him raiding the liquor cabinet. Tonight, he'd mostly gone to the party because Miranda Chen was there, though from his expression, I gathered that particular mission hadn't been successful. We took the back roads home, partly because it was shorter, partly because the county deputies like to set up checkpoints on the main highway on party nights. The full moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting everything in a silvery light that made the world look slightly unreal. The gravel crunched under my tires as we wound our way through the maze of field roads. Talking about nothing in particular, that's when we saw the raccoon. It was a big one, probably 15 or 20 pounds, waddling across the road with that peculiar rolling gait they have. I slowed down, mindful of my newly painted bumper. Derek was in the middle of telling me about something Miranda had said when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. What the hell is that? At first, I thought he was talking about the raccoon. Then I saw it, something moving in the darkness behind the animal, something that made my brain try to reject what my eyes were seeing. It came from the left side of the road, emerging from the cornfield like a shadow detaching itself from the greater darkness. The creature, and I struggle even now to call it that because the word seems inadequate, was impossibly tall. 7, maybe 8 feet of grey flesh stretched over a frame that looked both emaciated and powerful. Its arms hung almost to the ground, ending in hands that seemed too large for even its massive frame. But it was the way it moved that truly horrified me. Despite its size, it crossed the road in 3 fluid strides that seemed to defy physics. its joints bent in ways that suggested either incredible flexibility or an anatomy completely alien to anything I'd ever seen. The moonlight revealed patches where fur or skin was missing, exposing something underneath that gleamed wetly. Derek's scream snapped me out of my paralysis. He was pressing himself back against the seat, his eyes wide with terror. That reaction, more than anything else, convinced me that what I was seeing was real. You can doubt your own senses, convince yourself you're tired or imagining things, but when someone else sees the same impossible thing you're seeing, that's when true fear sets in. I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, and the truck's engine roared in response. The back end fishtailed on the loose gravel as we took off, throwing rocks against the undercarriage with a sound like hail. The speedometer crept past 60, then 80, then 100, but it didn't feel fast enough. Every shadow we passed could have been that thing. Every dark spot between the trees could have held more of them. We made it to Derek's family farm in record time, the truck's suspension protesting every curve and bump. His place was a century farm, one of those properties that had been in the same family for over 100 years. The main house was a massive 3-story Victorian that his great-grandfather had built, complete with a widow's walk that nobody ever used. Behind it stood the barn, a looming red structure that housed their remaining livestock, a few dairy cows and some goats his mum kept for making cheese. I barely had time to throw the truck into park before Derek was out the door, running for the house. The porch light cast a weak yellow glow that seemed to emphasize the darkness beyond rather than push it back. I was right behind him, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. That's when we heard it. The sound started low, almost subsonic, before rising to a pitch that made my teeth ache. It was like someone had taken the scream of a mountain lion and layered it over a woman's cry of terror, then played it through a broken speaker. The sound echoed off the barn and seemed to hang in the air far longer than it should have. Derek fumbled with his keys, cursing under his breath. Over his shoulder, I saw movement near the barn. A tall, human-like figure standing on the elevated terrace that ran along the building's west side. The moonlight caught it just right, and for a moment I could see those patches of missing skin again, could see the way its head moved in short, jerky motions like a bird studying its prey. Inside now. I shoved Derek through the door as soon as he got it open. We slammed it shut behind us, and Derek immediately started throwing the deadbolts. All 3 of them, installed by his paranoid uncle after a series of break-ins in the county last year. The house was dark except for a small nightlight in the kitchen. Derek's parents were away at a livestock auction in Omaha, leaving him to watch the place. Some guardian he'd turned out to be. We were both shaking so bad we could barely stand. "The gun's safe," Derek said suddenly. "Dad's guns are in the study." We made our way through the dark house, trying to avoid looking out any windows. The study was a small room off the main hallway, lined with agricultural magazines and old family photos. The gun safe stood in one corner, a heavy steel cabinet that had been a fixture in the house as long as I'd known the Mitchells. Derek knew the combination by heart. His dad had made him memorize it when he turned 12. Inside were several hunting rifles, a few shotguns, and Mr. Mitchell's prized AR-15. I grabbed the AR while Derek took his dad's .45 pistol. We checked that they were loaded, then took up positions in the living room, away from the windows, but where we could see both the front and back doors. "What the hell was that thing?" Derek's voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know." I was trying to keep my voice steady, but the image of that creature's fluid movement kept playing in my mind. "But it's not like anything I've ever seen before." We stayed up all night, jumping at every creak of the old house settling, every rustle of wind through the cornfields outside. Several times we heard that terrible scream again, each time seeming to come from a different direction. Around 4 a.m., something started walking on the roof. Heavy footsteps that moved from one end of the house to the other, punctuated by what sounded like claws scraping against the shingles. Dawn finally came, turning the sky from black to gray to pale blue. The morning light revealed nothing unusual around the house. No footprints, no signs of the terror we'd experienced. If it hadn't been for the guns still clutched in our trembling hands, we might have convinced ourselves it was all a shared hallucination. The next night, Derek's mom called with news that made our blood run cold. She was hysterical, barely able to get the words out between sobs. The livestock, their prized dairy cow and one of the goats, had been found dead in the pasture, their bodies torn apart with a violence that defied explanation. Derek put the phone on speaker so I could hear his mom's description. The animals hadn't been eaten, just destroyed. Whatever had killed them had displayed a kind of methodical savagery that went beyond normal predator behavior. The local veterinarian, Dr. Hansen, had been called out to examine the remains. He'd been studying animal attacks in the area for 30 years and had never seen anything like it. The wounds, he'd told Derek's mom, they're not consistent with any known predator. Mountain lions kill clean and wolves aren't established in this area. This was something else. That was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, we started noticing other strange things happening around the Mitchell farm. The incidents always seemed to cluster around the full moon, as if whatever was out there grew bolder when the night was brightest. About 3 weeks after the first encounter, we had a group over at Derek's place. His parents were still uneasy about the livestock incidents, but had reluctantly agreed to let him have some friends stay the night. There were 6 of us total. Derek and me, our friends Greg Anderson and Jay Martinez, and their girlfriends Katie and Sophia. We were all upstairs in Derek's room, which took up most of the second floor's west wing. The room was huge, typical of these old farmhouses, with tall windows that looked out over the property. We were watching horror movies on his laptop, ironically enough, when the tapping started. Tap, tap, tap. At first, we thought it was part of the movie. Then it came again, 3 distinct taps against the window glass. The sound had a deliberate quality to it, like someone trying to get our attention. But this was the second floor, a good 15 feet off the ground, with no trees anywhere near the house. Tap, tap, tap. Katie was the first to notice that the sound wasn't coming from the window we were facing, but from one behind us. We all turned slowly, the laptop screen casting just enough light to see the window in question. For a moment nothing moved, then we saw it, a long grey finger tapping against the glass. The nail at its tip looked more like a claw, scratching tiny patterns into the window's surface with each tap. Sophia screamed, and the finger withdrew instantly. Jay jumped up and turned on the overhead light, and we all crowded around the window, trying to see what had been there. The night outside was clear, the moon nearly full again, providing plenty of light to see that there was absolutely nothing that could have reached the window. No trees, no ladder, nothing. But when we looked closer at the glass, we could see the marks, 3 sets of small scratches arranged in a triangular pattern, too precise to be random, too deliberate to be explained away. A few days later, everything came to a head. Greg, Jay, and I were playing paintball in the wooded area behind Derek's property. It was something we did often. The woods provided natural cover, and we'd set up various obstacles and hiding spots over the years. We knew those woods like the backs of our hands, or at least we thought we did. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows between the trees. I called out that we should wrap it up and head back to start the bonfire we'd planned for later. Jay met up with me near our usual gathering spot, but Greg was nowhere to be seen. We waited a few minutes, thinking he was trying to get in one last ambush, but something felt wrong. The woods had gone quiet, that unnatural silence we'd experienced the night we first saw the creature. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. We started backtracking, calling Greg's name. That's when Jay spotted something in a drainage ditch, a huddled figure in Greg's familiar blue hoodie. Greg was curled into a tight ball, shaking violently. His paintball gun lay forgotten beside him, and his face was chalk white. "Greg! Man, what happened?" Jay reached for him, but Greg flinched away. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I heard Blake calling me, saying he found something cool that I needed to come see. He looked up at me with terrified eyes. It sounded exactly like you, but wrong. Like something was wearing your voice like an ill-fitting suit. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as Greg continued. I followed the voice deeper into the woods. It kept saying, "Come here, I'm over here," but something about it started to feel off. The voice got darker, hollow somehow. Then I saw it, standing between two trees so tall it had to bend down to fit under the branches. "Those arms! Those fucking arms!" He broke off, shuddering. I ran. I just ran as fast as I could, but I could hear it moving through the trees behind me. Not running, not really. More like gliding, like it was letting me run. I fell into this ditch and just froze. As if on cue, we heard it, that same ungodly scream that had haunted my dreams since that first night. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating through the growing darkness. Jay grabbed Greg's arm and hauled him to his feet. We ran back toward the house, not daring to look behind us. That night marked a turning point for all of us. Jay didn't even stay for the bonfire. He got in his truck and left, tires throwing gravel as he sped down the driveway. I couldn't blame him. Greg was still shaking when we got him inside, and it took 3 cups of hot coffee before he could speak normally again. The thing that truly terrified me wasn't just the creature's ability to mimic voices. It was the intelligence behind that mimicry. This wasn't some animal acting on instinct. Whatever this thing was, it was hunting us, playing with us, learning our patterns and habits, using our own voices against us. Derek's parents returned the next day to find their son and his friend, me, sitting in the kitchen with all the lights on, the AR-15 and .45 still within arm's reach. We tried to explain what had happened, but like most adults, they wanted rational explanations. They talked about coyotes, about teenagers playing pranks, about overactive imaginations, but they couldn't explain away everything. The scratches on the second-floor window, the deep inhuman footprints we found in the freshly tilled field behind the barn, the way their dogs refused to go outside after dark anymore, huddling in the basement and whining at sounds we couldn't hear. That was 6 months ago. I don't go to Derek's place at night anymore. None of us do. Greg transferred to a community college in Des Moines, saying he needed to be closer to his family, but we all knew the real reason. Jay stopped returning our calls after a while. Last I heard, he was seeing a therapist about stress-induced hallucinations. The Mitchell farm has changed. The livestock is gone now. Derek's parents sold the remaining animals after losing 2 more cows and a horse in mysterious circumstances. They installed security cameras and motion sensor lights, but the cameras never seem to work right on full moon nights. And the lights have a habit of shorting out at the worst possible moments. Derek still lives there, but he's different, quieter. He keeps a journal of everything he sees and hears, marking down dates and times with obsessive precision. The walls of his room are covered in research, newspaper clippings about similar incidents in the area, printouts of Native American legends about skinwalkers and wendigos, grainy photographs of things that might or might not be what we saw. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself going through my own research. I've learned that the Iowa-Nebraska border has a long history of strange occurrences. The Omaha tribe had stories about tall, gray creatures that walked like men but weren't men. Early settlers reported livestock mutilations similar to what we experienced. In 1954, an entire family disappeared from their farm just across the border in Nebraska, leaving behind a journal that described something watching from the corn. But what haunts me most is the possibility that we weren't special, that we weren't chosen or cursed or anything dramatic like that. We just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, catching a glimpse of something that's always been there. Hiding in the spaces between farms, in the shadows of the cornfields, in the depths of the border woods. I still drive those back roads sometimes, during the day when the sun is high and the world feels normal. The gravel crunches under my tires and the corn waves in the wind, and I can almost convince myself that nothing happened. Almost. But then the sun starts to set, and I remember the sound of those footsteps on the roof. The sight of those long grey fingers tapping on the window, the hollow mockery of my own voice calling from the woods, and I drive a little faster, keep my eyes straight ahead, and pray that whatever lives in those borderlands stays there, content to watch and wait and hunt in its own territory. Because deep down, I know the truth, it's still out there. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full and the wind carries strange sounds across the fields, I think it's getting closer. The summer I turned 14 was marked by long, lazy afternoons that seemed to stretch endlessly into the golden hour dusk. My friends and I spent most of those days at Mike's house, mainly because his backyard backed up against the largest stretch of woodland in our county. We'd grown up hearing all sorts of stories about those woods, mostly harmless urban legends about abandoned homesteads and forgotten graves that our older siblings used to scare us with. That particular Thursday started like any other. School had been out for 3 weeks, and the novelty of freedom hadn't yet worn off. Jake, Danny, and I had biked over to Mike's after lunch, our t-shirts already sticky with summer sweat. We'd been planning to build a fort in the woods for weeks, armed with nothing but teenage ambition and a vague understanding of architecture gleaned from Minecraft. We should go further in today, Mike suggested, gathering up some rope and his dad's old hammer. All the good spots near the creek are too visible from the trail, none of us argued. We'd been gradually pushing deeper into the woods all summer, each expedition taking us a little further from the familiar paths. The forest welcomed us with its usual symphony, birds calling overhead, leaves rustling in the warm breeze, twigs snapping beneath our sneakers. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor that we followed like breadcrumbs into the wilderness. About 30 minutes in, the woods began to feel different. The trees stood closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to create a natural ceiling that made the air feel heavier, more ancient. The familiar sounds of the forest had quieted to a whisper. That's when we saw him. He was standing in a small clearing about 50 feet ahead, his back initially turned to us. Even from behind, something about him seemed wrong. His posture was too perfect, his clothes, a crisp white shirt and dark slacks, too clean for someone this deep in the woods. When he turned, the wrongness intensified. His red hair was immaculately styled, not a strand out of place. His face was unremarkable in a way that made it impossible to focus on any single feature, like trying to remember the details of a dream upon waking. He didn't speak. He didn't make a sound. He just began walking toward us with purpose, his movements mechanical and precise. Jake was the first to run. The rest of us followed a heartbeat later, our feet pounding against the earth as panic seized our lungs. The man's footsteps behind us were unnaturally steady, maintaining the same measured pace regardless of the terrain. He never seemed to get closer, but he never fell behind either, like a shadow we couldn't shake. We ran without direction, our only thought to put distance between ourselves and our pursuer. Tree branches whipped at our faces, roots threatened to trip us, but the fear of looking back kept us moving. 2 miles felt like 20, our legs burning, lungs screaming for air. When we finally burst through the tree line into Mike's backyard, the late afternoon sun momentarily blinded us. Gasping for breath, we turned to face our pursuer, half expecting him to emerge from the shadows. He stood at the edge of the woods, his appearance unchanged, not a hair out of place, not a wrinkle in his clothes, not a bead of sweat on his eerily smooth forehead. For a moment that stretched like taffy, he simply stood there, staring at us with that unreadable face. Then, with the same deliberate movements, he turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing among the trees as if he'd never existed at all. We never saw him again, though we spent countless hours theorizing about who or what he might have been. The woods behind Mike's house suddenly seemed smaller after that day, less inviting. We still ventured in occasionally, but never as far as we had that Thursday afternoon. Sometimes on quiet days when the wind rustles through the leaves just right, I think I can hear footsteps, keeping that same steady, mechanical pace through the underbrush. The fort we'd planned to build remained unfinished, our tools abandoned somewhere in that frantic run home. But something else was built that day. A shared understanding that some mysteries are better left unexplored, some questions better left unasked. The man with the red hair taught us that some parts of the wilderness don't belong to us and never will.